Hello, I am Chauncey DeVega. You may recognize my voice from Ring of Fire Radio with Mike Papantonio, the BBC, Sirius XM, or the Tom Hartman Radio Show. And you may have read some of my essays at places like Salon and Alternet. I would like to thank all of you for listening to, downloading, tweeting, and sharing the eponymously named podcast known as The Chauncey DeVega Show.
And they ran a story by somebody named Chauncey DeVega.
Quote, I find black garbage pail kids, black conservatives, fascinating.
It's just unbelievable. You know,
he goes by the name of Chauncey DeVega.
You know, I've been called Uncle Tom, Oreo, sellout, shameless, but this is a new one.
Well, let's talk now to Chauncey DeVega.
As my man Chauncey DeVega of the blog We Are Respectable Negroes said,
I have author and blogger Chauncey DeVega here with us.
Down goes Chauncey. Down goes Chauncey. Down goes Chauncey. That was my imitation of the late great sports announcer Howard Cosell calling Ali Frazier when he said, down goes Frazier, down goes Frazier, down goes Frazier. So folks who have followed my writings, musings, observations, and other chimings in at ChaunceyDeVega.com about my recent leg injury. I'm still sitting here with a swollen up, busted up knee too. We'll talk about that. I know you all folk are tired. They're like, why is Chauncey still talking about his damn near broken leg? Well, I'm talking about it because it tells us something about society. That's not narcissism or ego. It's the I in the political. And as I hinted at with Bill the Lizard, as we talked about Mad Max Fury Road, stories are legends and they will change over time. And it will become exaggerated, magnified. But this is the first cut. This is the real cut. This is what actually happened to me last week that I've been spending so much time just trying to get better from. So last Thursday, I had embarked upon seeing Mad Max Fury Road. I got on the bus. I went to, or was about to go to my designated movie theater in downtown Chicago, where I like to see the good shows on a Thursday night. I looked at the Chicago Reader, saw it was opening early. I said, you know, Mad Max Fury Road by my man George Miller, creator and director and writer of Babe, the greatest movies to ever be made. Get on the bus, go downtown. Some time to kill. I was going to get some falafel and a Coca-Cola and some candy and settle in at the movie theater. Now, something told me, because I'm not one to walk around with a lot of cash, because that's a recipe to get hit over the head and rob, but I said, let me take $100, 100 ducats, and put it in the pocket. I'm usually a $25 to $30 guy. That's all I need. That's bus, that's a snack, and emergency money to get a cab. So I'm downtown walking around before down goes Chauncey. Down goes Chauncey occurred. And several years ago, I had made a bargain with myself about a comic book store that I felt that I was treated in a disrespectful way. And I said, I will never go back to this comic book store. I don't know. Maybe it was Mad Max Fury Road was in my blood. Maybe I feeling good about the nice weather and it started to rain, but I didn't care. I don't know. Maybe karmic energy. So I decide to go down to this comic book store and I take a right off of a certain street towards Michigan Avenue. I'm strutting. I got my phone in my pocket, thinking about my strutting music I may put on, paying attention, so I thought, because it's raining. And I hear a sound. Oh, shit. You know, I'm not one to swear, but that's what happened. And I thought someone was yelling at me because a car was going to hit me in the alleyway. Next thing you know, I'm looking up at the sky. I must have looked like a break dancer doing his ground effects, going down, popping and locking, up rocking, down rocking. Because we don't call break dancers break dancers, we call them B-boys or B-girls. And this brother, black Latino dude, runs over to me. He's like, man, you need some help. And I said, no, I'm fine. I pulled myself up somehow. And I looked down. I had tripped and somehow fallen so that my back was on the ground. I'm looking up at the sky. My right leg is under me. The knee is on the ground. My left leg had planted. I don't know what you call that, but it was real. I pull myself up against the building and I say, I'm fine. I just thought I had fallen down randomly. I go to the comic book store and I get a comic I've been looking for. It was a cross between the collected volume 2 of this great series you should be reading, by the way, called Manifest Destiny, or the Collected Nick Fury Volume 2, where we meet the Punisher and Barracuda. Barracuda is the greatest caricature of blackness I've ever seen, and he's profoundly offensive but wonderfully readable. So I get my Nick Fury. So I'm in line, pay it, look down, and my pants are bleeding. I don't mean like a nick, I mean bleeding. I was like, damn, what the hell happened? But the pants are not torn. So I'm hobbling, my leg isn't hurting. I was like, I tore my nail, whatever. I'm a tough man. I'm a tough, strong, working class black man. Ain't nothing going to stop me from going to Mad Max Fury Road. Now let me say that if I had known what had happened to me, I would have got in the bus or the cab and gone straight away home. That's what adrenaline does. I don't know. So I walk and I say, let me go to Burlington Coat Factory. Irregular. Always Sunny joke again. That's 2 episodes in a row where I think I made an Always Sunny joke. So I go in there because I know you can use the toilet, because I have used those facilities on many occasions, because I have a cognitive map about where clean toilets are, because you never know when nature will call. So I go to the toilet and I said, let me just check my leg. Maybe I'll buy a pair of pants here at Burlington Coat Factory. They got them expensive Buffalo brand jeans. I know you all are wearing them. $120 on sale for $40. Irregular, but they say they aren't, but I think they are. I'll buy a pair of jeans, then go to the movie. But I'm going to see Mad Max Fury Road. I don't need to be fancy. I don't need to be special. This is a post-apocalyptic dream of a movie. So I go in the movie, I go into the toilet, and no one's in there, thank goodness. I get in the stall and I pull my pants up, and I'm bleeding. I was like, don't let the bone be hanging out. No bone is showing. It's just a skin knee. I'm feeling good. I'm tough. I don't need new pants. I'll tough it out. So I walk about 7 or 8 blocks to the movie theater. Every step is harder than the last. Every movement hurts more and more. And people are looking at me, but, it's a big city. Maybe they think I'm homeless. Maybe they think I'm mentally ill. Maybe they think I'm drunk. Either way, you should still help people, by the way. Somehow I get to Michigan Avenue. I had stopped and got some candy and other victuals. I was going to fill up my drinking flask for Mad Max Fury Road, but I didn't do it because I was like, let me just get to the theater. And I'm a pretty fast walker, but this was a slow walk. I looked down at my watch. The movie is starting at about 9ish. I'm damn near like 8:45. I should have been there before. Something ain't right. I hobble, and again, every step is harder to the theater. I get on the escalator. I go up the theater. I get my ticket. I'm walking slower and slower and slower. And I said, let me go to the bathroom, because something is not right. So I get to the toilet. I check my knee, and it has swollen up. Not a grapefruit, but about half a grapefruit. Now, here's the dilemma. I'm already at the theater. I'll just sit down. I'm going to watch this amazing movie, and I'll deal with it later. Adrenaline, stupidity, both, I don't know. I go to the theater, and the movie starts, and it is absolutely unbelievably awesome. Mad Max Fury Road is one of the greatest things I have ever seen. It is a 4-star classic. Volumes will be written about it. But I'm sitting in the theater, and I don't know why people do this. You see somebody sitting there. Why do you insist on sitting near them? My standard go-to seat is left side all the way, 2 seats in. I know the theater is filling up. You don't need to be near me. You can go to the middle. You can go to the top. You can go to the bottom. But these damn people, and you hear me gritting my teeth, insist on making me move my leg to sit near me. Don't I look like I'm in pain? Don't I look like I'm hurting? Come on. But they're going to do their thing. Movie starts, and I must have looked like some man in a 1970s or 1980s Times Square porno movie theater rubbing on his dingus. You know what the dingus is. But I'm just rubbing my knee trying to get circulation. And I'm in pain, horrible pain. I've broken a limb before. I know pain. I almost cut my thumb off once in a fool accident. I know pain. And the funny thing is, actually, when I almost cut my thumb off, that didn't actually hurt until later. I guess that's what sharp objects do. Movie ends. Everybody's leaving, and I'm still sitting there. So I got my jacket, I got my bag. I'm looking around. The couple next to me are arguing about the film. And I said, okay, I got to get out of here. Now, at this point, it's about 11:15, 11:20. I can't get up. And I'm in panic mode. No one is offering to help me. The people next to me are just ignoring me. So I get the leverage to stand up. It took me about 20 minutes to get from my chair to the outside of the theater. Not the building, that screening. I'm walking slow, and I'm being real. I was on the verge of tears. I said, I have broken my leg. Something bad has happened to me. My leg is swollen up. I sit down on one of the benches, and I pull my pants up again. I don't give a damn. My knee is swollen up even more. It's bleeding even more. And I'm saying, dear God, I'm hurt. I'm downtown. It's in the rain. What the hell am I going to do? What am I going to do? So I use that fancy smartphone that I bought, which I hardly ever use, to look up knee injuries, look up what to do, and it's indicating ACL, meniscus. Who the hell knows what's wrong? I just know I'm messed up. So I hobble again, and you know what? I'm making eye contact with people. I'm looking at people. I'm bleeding from my leg. No one has to, help me. No one has to say, hey, what's up? No one has to, I'm not asking anybody to carry me on their shoulders. What about, compassion for your fellow human being? What about telling the manager? What about telling the security guards? There's something wrong with this guy. He needs help. Go to the bathroom again. My knee is still swollen. And I'm literally hobbling. It's on one leg, trying to support myself, making facial expressions. My body language is wrong. Anybody watching would know this is a person. And I'm not a saint. I got a lot of flaws. God knows that. Fate knows that. The force knows that. But I'd like to believe I wouldn't leave somebody in that state. And here's where it gets complicated, because your brain starts working, because you know the social psychology involved. This is the bystander effect. There are local norms and rules about when to intervene, how to intervene, and I'm just hoping that someone comes over to help me, which will establish a new rule about helping others. Yeah, I could have raised my hand. I could have pleaded. I could have begged, but I don't know if I was in shock or I was just terrified. And I was thinking, I got to call my mom. What if something happens to me? I'm blessed to have people here in Chicago that care about me. I called them. They were asleep. I know if I kept calling, I'm hoping their phones aren't off. They'd pick up. And I'm on the verge. I'm on that verge, being real, where you say to yourself, I have finite resources. My insurance ain't that great. Do I go to the hospital and pay all this money to get sent home, or do I just try to get home, deal with it, and see what happens? I hadn't eaten. I didn't know what to do. So I hobble, and here's again, the same movie theater, and I'm on the verge. I'm telling you, just real, dropping the mask. These security guards at this theater will harass people who they think are sneaking into movies. They won't help a hurt person. I'm making eye contact with them, nothing. And I told my mom's, and she's like, well, maybe it's because you're black. I was like, no, Mom. And other people say that too. Black folks looked at me and looked back down at their damn phones instead of helping me. That's sick. Talk about this lie of intergroup familiarity and allegiance and alliance and bonding capital, whatever. Their rule was, person looking in pain, I don't want to get involved. So I hobble somehow down the escalator. I'm terrified of falling off of that. I get outside. It's raining. And here's how random life is. There's four white young folk, teenagers, early 20s, drunk out of their minds, carrying each other, carrying one who's just laid the hell out. And people were concerned about them. I'm trying not to cry. I'm bleeding. I'm hopping on one leg, and no one says a damn thing to me. By Crom, the Force, JC, Soul Brother number 1, whatever powers of the universe you believe in, there's a cab. The cab driver opens the door. I was like, I just need to get back home. Thank God I had that money on me, because I ain't one to use credit cards and cabs. I just don't do it. I get home. I hop in the horrible driving rain into the apartment. Look at my leg. It's even worse. I'm on the internet. I'm calling people. Thank God for the folk who call me back. And man, let me tell you, thank God I also had some medicine from oral surgery, prescription strength, ibuprofen, Valium, other things. I took a bunch of that, ice, elevated the leg, and I had been laid up. That was a Thursday. I was laid up till Sunday, and my leg still ain't right. And I want to thank Bill the Lizard, his brother-in-law, his sister-in-law, a friend of them, a friend of theirs here in Chicago who's an LPN who I talked to, who looked at things, talked to her, and they're saying, give it time. Swung will go down. I'm getting better. I can put weight on my leg. I can move. I'm ambulatory, but it really made me think about the elderly. It made me think about shut-ins. It made me think about the least of us, the hurt, people who don't have friends like I have. And I want to send love out to my friends who came around and brought me goodies and victuals and were worried about me. I'm thinking about practical stuff. How do you use the toilet? What if you're walking with a bum leg and you can't get to the toilet? And what's going on with our society? We are not a society that is especially kind to strangers, I don't believe, or to the other. Used to lynch people publicly, burned witches, ignore the homeless, this culture of cruelty. We have categories that we use arbitrarily to marginalize other human beings. So I'm under no illusion about our goodness. And sure there's anthropologists who have all sorts of measures to determine social closeness, density of ties, and say America is like some countries and not like others in terms of how we treat the hurt, the sick, the dying, the vulnerable. But this has made me think about a lot of things. A lot of things. That's why I was writing about it so much on the website. So I want to indulge. Thank you all for indulging me on that. I'm processing still. So I keep saying I'm going to volunteer. I have some homeless brothers and sisters who I help out routinely. But I'm thinking I talk it, but I got to do it. To look into doing something with outreach for shut-ins and the elderly, because I can't imagine being robbed in a long-term way of my mobility. And things are getting better. I'm setting up a doctor's appointment. If things don't get better in the short term, about 65% back mobility. Flexibility is there. Still a lot of pain. But we're getting there. And I want to thank you all for indulging me. Now you know how Chauncey got knocked, I won't say to F out like in Friday, but who ended up with his leg all tore up, worried that he broke it, crying or on the verge of tears, scared and terrified. But we got a good show. That's 15 minutes of the story that I've been talking about. So folks know that I was on Ring of Fire this week. Ring of Fire Radio TV have now gone Monday to Friday. You can watch them 8:30 Eastern, 7:30 p.m. Central. I should be on there much more frequently. That's because of you guys and your support, your kindness, your love, your affection, your tweeting, your sharing, your downloading. So folks will be able to watch me and my musings and my big, abnormally large head on the internet TV thing and also on direct TV. So that's going to create opportunities. So I was on this week talking about Baltimore, the Young Lions there, trying to do some truth telling with the great Mike Papantonio, who always gives me some shine. And also I want to give some love to Ferron Cousins, who always give me some love too. He's a producer for Ring of Fire. And that was just a good show. It was 8 minutes. Did my thing. You can see, it's on the website. In the beginning, I was distracted because my leg was killing me and my leg is propped up. So I'm sort of at an angle. So this episode, I'm going to shut up right now. We got a lot of things we could be joking about. Barack Obama on Twitter, the racial slurs that have greeted him. If you go to the Google machine, the internet machine, and type in White House, it will say nigger house. Is that a surprise given what we know about cyber racism and how Google is probably integrating all its data? And that's what too many of the white American public in private and others actually think about our first president, who happens to be black. Of no surprise to anybody, by the way, based on how we've seen the Republican Party behave and their hair-invoked white supremacist, white right bigotry against the country's first president, who happens to be black, who is really a Rockefeller Republican, but the symbolic power of a black man and his family in the White House is still too much for them to deal with. I have a new piece I just finished up on Baltimore and this Waco shootout with the outlaw bikers. I got a really cool guest coming up on the podcast in the near future who knows a hell of a lot about outlaw bikers. I don't want to give it away. He and I have been trying to build for some time, so that should be coming together. And we have a lot of smart folks saying, well, that white privilege is part of how the corporate media has created a disparate narrative around the events in Baltimore where black youth are depicted as rioting and white outlaw bikers who kill people. 9 people, 18 wounded, 165, 70 arrested, and still more trouble to come. How the corporate media goes out of its way to not refer to those guys as thugs. So I got something on that. My take is a little different. I think there's something going on about white identity and white racial logic. And it is really about language, about cognitive processes, or what we call a cognitive map, and also about ego. So you should see that on ChaunceyDeVega.com and probably other sites as well next week. We'll see when that one drops. So a 2-parter. This week, as I said, Bill the Lizard and I talk about Mad Max Fury Road. That's part 1. And our featured guest, very, very good guest, Dr. David Krugler. He's written a great book about the bloody summers of 1919, but he is writing about African-American resistance to white racial violence in the aftermath of World War I. Why did these pogroms and race riots happen after World War I? And he and I also have a great detour. And as I've said many times, quality control. Here on the Chauncey DeVega Show, I bring you good people, smart people, interesting and smart people doing interesting and smart things, who are saying interesting and smart things about matters of important public concern. See, I twisted a little bit there. You see, I added something at the end if you're a careful listener. So we also talk about the Cold War, Jim and Jane Crow, and the color line. And we have an obligatory, because I'm a ghetto nerd, hip-hop generation child of the 80s, mention of the movie Red Dawn and American civil defense planning in the aftermath of a hypothetical World War III conflict and invasion by foreign forces and nuclear war. So, without further ado, next segment, the one and only Bill the Lizard, my heterosexual life partner, friend, brother from another mother, method man to red man. He and I chop it up for a little bit about Mad Max Fury Road. And after that segment, we'll sit down and we'll be chatting with the one and only Dr. David Krugler, about those bloody red summers after World War I and racial pogroms, whiteness, ethnicity, African-American resistance, violence, and the American Democratic Project. As always, I do think you'll enjoy the show.
Bill the Lizard, joining us again for our geekly, courtly conversation. Will you say it with me? Valhalla!
Valhalla!
You gotta go with the flow. We're talking about Mad Max Fury Road. How do you feel about the Chrome? The Chrome will set you free. The Chrome is immortal. The Chrome is God.
You do that much better than I do.
But Bill the Lizard, we have been talking a lot about Mad Max, the genius George Miller. Folks know that I fell and almost broke my leg. I'm going to do a whole story about that, and just as when I fought off a hooga-mooga highwayman years ago, that story will become exaggerated to where I fought off 10 men bare-handed. So the story of my near leg breaking will, of course, become exaggerated over the years to me having an open fracture that I pushed the bone back into and hobbled over 2 miles to see Mad Max Fury Road. But it wasn't that bad, but it was mighty uncomfortable, and I tore something in my knee. But Mad Max Fury Road was so awesome. Quite frankly, I was thoroughly distracted for the 2 hours that I was sitting there in misery. So what are your thoughts on the film? Yay or nay, equally awesome and amazing?
No, I thought it was amazing. The whole first part of the movie was just completely amazing, like nonstop. And the thing that I liked the most about it is that it was like completely moved through the setup stuff really quickly, and it got right to the meat of it. There was no filler here. It was just all meat. It was really, really good. And having said that, I mean, through all the action, through all the, the intense action, the first opening chases are just amazing. I mean, and it gets better and better as the movie goes on. But there's actually some periods where, it actually kind of calmed down for a second, so you actually had this great dynamic between the characters. Just fantastic. Can't say enough good things about it.
I was sitting there with a bunch of people. I went and saw it, as I said, Thursday night, post-leg injury, in the rain. It was about 80% full. And there were quite literally moments, and I will indulge profanity for a moment, where people were saying, and looking at each other and saying, holy shit.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's the whole communal experience of going to the movies, and that's why I don't understand people who download movies, who buy bootlegs. There's no replacement for going to the theater.
Yeah, I would agree.
And having that sort of communal moment where you sit in the theater, you make the bargain, we're going to see something that's not real, but we're going to believe in it for these 2 hours or 90 minutes or 3 hours, and the movie quite literally just starts. And it's like, it's anthropological almost. It's like we're watching a documentary film where there's no explanation for anything you're going to see. This is a world that just exists.
I mean, there are very few movies that I've seen where I have to say that the entire crowd is basically mesmerized by the screen.
Yep.
And this happened to be one of them. I mean, there are a few movies and stuff that I've seen in the past that basically, like, let's say, for example, Independence Day, the first half hour of that movie was really good. And I thought, people were like, as soon as everything ends and it's like the day after, like, people are all clapping and stuff like that, and it was really impressive. But, I mean, the rest of the movie kind of fell short.
Well, the first Matrix
was
something that, was not original by any stretch of the imagination.
No.
But it was so wonderfully synthetic, and I love the Wachowskis. I remember seeing that movie, and everybody's like, what did we just see?
Right. Well, I mean, that's the thing. I mean, like, the concepts from the Matrix had been around for a while. The whole idea of cyberpunk, Necromancer, which I believe was a book where, like, the Matrix as a term was used for the first time, or at least one of the first times. So the concepts that have been around, but I think what really made the Matrix stand out, even though it's very similar to Dark City, and I actually kind of prefer Dark City, but that's a whole other subject. I think one of the reasons why the Matrix stands out is because it was a visual realization, a visual realizing of those concepts. And I think that was something that people really latched on to. To bring it back to Mad Max, obviously Mad Max, the first one, the 1979 movie, Road Warrior, they kind of set the tone for what people assume Mad Max is. And this movie, though, is basically a full massive Hollywood budget movie with a budget that blows the other movies away.
$150 million.
Right, exactly. $150 million. And you can see it's well spent. I mean, the whole movie is just so impressive. I mean, the gravitas are just so... It's just so impressive. I mean, not only did they get the amazing actors, I mean, Charlize Theron is amazing. Nicholas Hoult, who plays Nux, amazing. I mean, their two story arcs alone are well worth the price of admission. Tom Hardy, I mean, people are saying, well, this isn't Max's movie, and why is it called Mad Max if he's not really Max's movie? Spoilers. The reality is that you just as in all of the movies, you see the world through Max's eyes. And I think that he does an amazing job of basically anchoring down the cast in a way that makes them relatable to us. Keen's Brian, I think I'm saying it's Byrne, who played Immortan Joe, who was also Toe Cutter in the first movie.
And he's a member of the Royal Shakespeare Theatre Company.
Yeah, he was fantastic. I mean, everybody was fantastic in this movie. I mean, really, the acting was really, really good. And even though, and there's some scenes where, like, a lot of lines aren't said, you just kind of, like, you understand what's going on. There's enough happening so that, like, you know people's motivations just by like, kind of, like, getting injected into the scene.
That's not an accident. So George Miller did an interview for a podcast. I guess he must be George Miller's nephew or godson or dear friend, because I have no idea how he got George Miller to do this 2 days ago. Maybe George Miller's just a nice guy, because it's like a new podcast. Maybe the guy's an industry person. And it's about an hour long, and George Miller basically talks about how he basically wanted to make a silent film. And he sat down with his production people and writers, and he said what they did was they took a year. And the man is very conscious of his own mythos, so we'll take this with a grain of salt, but I wouldn't be surprised. He's so just determined. He said they took a year and they just, every day they drew pictures and drew it like a comic book almost. And he said he wanted to make it like a silent Japanese film. And he said by the end they had 3,000 different pictures. And they put them up on the wall. They did it chronologically. And then they went afterwards and wrote in the dialogue only where it was necessary. And after seeing it, I absolutely believe it. I mean, the movie could be a silent film.
Well, I think so, too. I mean, and that's the thing, too. I mean, he's very conscious of his own work, and he's a very varied director. I mean, from, he did Lorenzo's Oil, right? And he did, I think he did. No, he didn't.
Yeah, he did Lorenzo's Oil.
Okay, and then he did, Happy Feet with the Penguins, and then
Happy Feet 1 and 2, Babe 1 and 2.
Babe, I don't know if he did the first Babe, but he definitely did Taking the Sip.
He did the first Babe.
Did he? Okay, and so, but either way, he's done all of very varied work, and the thing is, he's a very smart guy. I mean, obviously he's a very smart guy. He even brought in, a writer and feminist author who did the Vagina Monologues in order to consult to make the female characters, more substantial and also basically make it a more of a feminist movie. And you can tell he did an amazing job of making this not only something that I would think that you can analyze like on a socio-political level, not only something that you can analyze on an action movie level, but also something that actually says something. And that for an action movie, or a supposedly brainless action movie, is really saying something.
So much going on thematically. So we have the questions about fertility, freedom, humanity, destiny, biopolitics, and the idea that people are simply worth what their bodies can provide, resource wars. But, I mean, the whole idea with Max, so I'm sitting in the theater, everybody is like sitting there awestruck, and there's a couple next to me, and of course I spread my stuff out because I don't want anybody near me, and of course my leg is hurting me, but I just don't like sitting near people. So like when I'm in the theater and I look around, I don't know why people do this. You have anywhere else you could sit. Why the hell do you want to sit next to me? There's some social psychologists who've done research on this. Like, have you ever been in a theater by yourself and like you sit in the ideal seat, and then of course somebody comes and sits near you because they don't want to be alone. And they said it's like the people go and they try to sit near people because they want to feel some sense of companionship. So people like me will just get up and move and be annoyed. And then sometimes those weirdos follow you. That's neither here nor there. So this guy and his girlfriend or wife, they're arguing about the film. So he's got to be late 30s, early 40s, maybe even a little older, because there was two guys in the movies who had to be 70. And then I thought about us being 70 watching Star Wars. I was like, these are guys who watched the first Mad Max, and they're going to see this, and they're super excited, and they're like in awe over seeing something from their youth. So he's telling her it's an awesome movie, and she's like, there's no character development. It's flat. Mad Max doesn't change. Why would anybody like this? And if I wasn't in agony, I would have turned over and said to her, that's the point. Mad Max, he's a myth. He's the fixed point in the narrative. Yeah. He's the man with no name in the No Name trilogy. He's a Ronin in a Kurosawa movie. Right. He's Toshiro Mifune. He's not going to change, and that's the point.
Exactly. Yojimbo. I mean, that I think is the beauty of the character. And that's the thing, too. I went into this movie really focused on chronology. I was like, where does this fit into the Mad Max ethos? How does this actually fit in? And we had this conversation before we had even seen it about, how Miller was basically saying that this is kind of like, doesn't fit in at all to the chronology. It's actually its own thing. But I guess loosely, if you did want to fit it in, I guess it's technically after Thunderdome. Going in, I was like, I don't know how I feel about that, but I have to say, after seeing the movie, I respect that, and now it makes sense to me. The idea that basically, these are legends put on film. Could have how it happened.
Well, there's actually some answers in the George Miller interview. See, when you actually try to find answers, the mythology is either confirmed or disconfirmed, and the movie made even more fascinating. So as I always say about you and I, when we had the podcast where we talked about Star Wars, always trying to show for that, because I think we were more right than wrong.
Yeah.
And I think when the movies come out, I think we're going to be laughing because we predicted a lot of this stuff. Just like I say to the folks making the new Godzilla sequel, go to my Facebook page for ChaunceyDeVega.com and look at my treatment. Because I think you're going to make my movie, and you're going to have to give me a bit part, or I'm going to throw a fit on Twitter. That's neither here nor there. But point being, I think we're pretty right on that. So George Miller answers a lot of the questions that we had. So one of the things you and I were talking about earlier was, okay, in this movie, we see the music box.
Right.
And in the first movie, his son had a music box, or his daughter rather had a music box.
Well, no, that's one of the things that got changed. You see, in Sprague, I think was his son in the first movie.
Yep. So we have the music
box. Sprague is killed, but like in this movie, he has a daughter who is.
Yep, and he talks about that in the interview.
Right.
So we talked about the car being the same, and here's an interesting Easter egg. George Miller, basically, that is the same car from the first Road Warrior, the first two movies. And he said, I wanted continual, these are elements that have history. He wanted them in there, just like we see a lot of the same actors show up, or several of the same actors. So the interviewer asked him, he's like, oh, what is the chronology? And like you and I basically said, to paraphrase Miller, he says, if you try to figure it out, you'll just get frustrated. He said, this is a legend. And he said, it doesn't matter. And so the interviewer asked him about the music box. He's like, well, the music box plays a different song.
Right.
And he said, I just like the idea of having the music box in the movie. He's like, it's not the same one. And then he pointed out the question about the child being the same. He's like, no, one was a boy, one is a girl. And he said, you have to accept Mad Max is a myth.
Right.
And these are myths from the wastelands. And that's what apparently the sequel is going to be called, Mad Max Myth from the Wasteland or something.
Well, that's the interesting thing about like, for example, the music box. I mean, it's almost kind of like All Quiet on the Western Front. The main character at the end of the film reaches out of the trench to pick up a butterfly, I believe, or something like that, and gets shot and killed. Butterfly has a meaning. The butterfly represents the ideal of peace crashed down and destroyed by the harshness of war, but it's also his soul. But the music box has that kind of meaning, too. In the original Mad Max, I think it was when Road Warrior it popped up, I think originally. The idea it's given to the young, savage kid who sits there and plays it all the time. It's a lost remnant of technology, something that can't be made anymore probably, or if it can be, it's very difficult. It's priceless in that sense. And it's basically, been given to this kid, and it's basically, showing the kindness that can be given as well as a bunch of other stuff. The fact that...
And Miller talks about the narrators. The third movie, Beyond Thunderdome, we have a narrator.
Yeah, it's the woman.
Right?
I don't remember her name, but yeah, it's...
And then in the second one, it's narrated by the young boy telling the story about, Mad Max and encountering their community and the oil, and then the MacGuffin with the truck being chased and it's full of sand. So the interviewer, again, because Miller is just transparent, I was like, man, he's not pulling any punches. He's telling you exactly what his thought process was. So the other podcast interviewer asked him, he's like, oh, could it be that we're seeing now as some of the characters is the kid who's now grown up from the second Mad Max movie? And Miller sort of laughs. He's like, no.
Yeah.
He's like, this is a legend. And you'll see echoes, but these are not the same people.
Right. I think it's interesting that the only movie that I think does not have a quote-unquote narrator is Mad Max, the first one, because it's from his vantage point. That really is his story. And the thing is, in the reality, too, I mean, one of the things that I always thought was really interesting about Mad Max is that the first movie is very different than Road Warrior. I guess Mad Max 2. And Mad Max 2 is very different than Thunderdome. And I think people get obsessed about the idea that Mad Max, the whole film series, is Road Warrior. That somehow, they either don't see the first one or they only remember the action sequences from the first one, and then they criticize Thunderdome for not being action-packed enough. And, where's the car? The thing is, the reality is in Road Warrior, the car gets destroyed in the first part of the movie. The car only comes into Mad Max at the end of the movie. And similarly, because Miller is a smart guy, in this movie, the car, spoilers, is destroyed almost instantaneously. I mean, it's there, and then it's gone. And I think that's the ultimate, that's the ultimate kind of, directorial kind of, backhand. We're basically, that's what fans want to see. And basically you're saying that we're moving past that. And I think.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting point about the car being destroyed. So the movie opens, and I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on philosophically, too, about nihilism. Because, some other, I don't know if it was New York Magazine or somebody writing over at Slater Salon or IO9 made a very interesting point. They said that the new Mad Max is really a movie about people who have ideology.
Right.
Right? The actor who plays Toe Cutter, who plays, what is it, Immortan Joe? The leader.
Yeah.
He has a belief system. He wants his breeders back. Right? These are the only women who are fertile in that world and who can have healthy babies. Then you have the women who are the sex slaves who want their freedom, right? And just as we don't know if she's a soothsayer, a mother, a mentor, and that's the beauty of this movie, is that there's not a lot of useless exposition where he sits down and tells you who these people are. They just exist. Right. And there's all sorts of ambiguity, which I think can frustrate more traditional, or I would dare say simple-minded viewers who want all the answers. Imperia, the driver of the war rig or the war dragon? Whatever the hell that badass truck is called.
Furiosa? Imperator Furiosa?
Yeah, Furiosa. She wants to do the right thing, and she wants to find her people. But Max is a nihilist. He says in the beginning, all he's focused on is survival.
Right.
That's all he cares about is surviving. So his character arc is flat, but then even within his sort of man with no name Ronin moment, he then chooses to help them at the end for his own purposes.
Mad Max is called Mad Max because basically, he's a little bit insane in the first movie, and finally,
in a world that's gone mad.
And finally, at the end of the movie, he snaps. He stops being a cop and just becomes basically an instrument of revenge. And the thing is, I think he maintains that through Road Warrior. I mean, though he does do the right thing, I don't think he can forgive himself. I mean, that's not to get all metaphysical. I don't think he can forgive himself, so as a result, he can never settle down. He's never the type. He's not going to go with the people who he has helped in any of the movies because he is the Ronin. He is beyond redemption in his own eyes, so therefore must wander.
That's an excellent point.
That's why he's so interesting. And that's the thing. He does harken back a little bit. I mean, we talked about, for example, Kurosawa movies, Samurai, Yojimbo, but also The Man with No Name with Clint Eastwood, spaghetti westerns, that whole thing. They all kind of play into this. And the thing is, that's why one of the interesting things about Mad Max and why I think it resonates so much in the U.S. as well as in Australia is because, U.S. and Australia have very similar histories overall, and so as a result, a history of the Western just as much as we do. This is kind of a retelling of that type of story. You can imagine Max as a gunslinger in the West. He has that type of thing. The car is his horse. Horse gets shot out from under him, but he keeps going.
In the next movie, he'll show up with a horse that looks just like it.
Right, exactly. For no other reason than just because.
And Max, and you're onto something. I mean, he's such a remarkably adaptive figure because, not to become too Joseph Campbellian, because I think his work on the monomyth and the hero of 1,000 faces is overused, but Max can become he can fit within any culture's mythology because it's a universal myth.
Right.
He can become a samurai, he can become a wandering bandito, or he can become a Robin Hood, or he can become the Man with No Name in the Italian westerns. And I'm sure there are a lot of other examples. Maybe he can become a noble Cossack, if that's a genre in Russia. But he's just, the character is so adaptable. What were some of the moments where you were just in disbelief, or some of your favorite moments from the movie?
I would have to say, the whole first part I think was completely amazing. But one of the things I think that really kind of blew me away beyond the physical action, because we mentioned that a lot. And I think it's easy in an overview to, especially a short 20 minutes, to get focused on the action. But the parts that really, really, really hit me the most, and that I enjoyed the most, was watching Nux's arc from Warboy to man, and not just a testosterone man, but a real man, a man who makes sacrifices and who works with people and attempts to try and do the right thing. And so watching his arc and some of the moments that he had with Furiosa were just really, really, really good. And Furiosa's arc too, I thought was just really good. Her interactions with the women, especially with the tribe when she meets a tribe and that whole thing, I thought was extremely good. To me was probably one of the best parts of the movie. The fact that Max was there and played very ably by Tom Hardy, who I kind of think is kind of a method actor, I think is just really, really, is one of the reasons why this movie is so good. I think if the cast between, Charlize Theron, Tom Hardy, and Nicholas Hoult, I don't think if they were good, I think this movie might not be as good. But the fact that they are so spot on, coupled with the action, just makes this, honestly, 10 out of 10.
He's got some balls on him. Talk about, geek street credo. Because he got to play Bane, and now he's Mad Max.
Yeah.
And he just embodies it, for a moment, and I think they were talking about early on having a cameo from Mel Gibson, which I think would have been distracting.
Mm-hmm.
Like I say, you see a movie, and this is the sort of movie like Star Wars for me, and I'm sure other movies for other folks, that make you want to write screenplays.
I know.
And make you want to write a film. There are going to be young people who go to this movie and say, I want to make movies now.
Exactly.
Because of the loving, it's like when we saw Star Wars, or people saw George Lucas' Star Wars in 77, they left the theater and said, I want to do this.
Right.
Maybe I'll write fiction. Maybe I'll make film. But this movie is going to inspire so many people to want to make movies.
Especially considering, like I said, this is an equal opportunity movie. I mean, in the sense that, you know, it caters not only to the people who want hardcore action, but also to the people who want, you know, really story-infused plot. I mean, yes, it doesn't give you a ton of backstory.
Well, it's basically a chase film.
Right.
I mean, it's wonderfully linear. It's a chase film.
Right. But the thing is, but having said that, I mean, you know, it's actually fairly deep. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on, and I think that actually, you know, pays dividends as the movie goes forward, because by the end of it, you are really involved with these characters. And the thing is, I mean, I found myself at the end when the characters started dying, especially, you know, of Furiosa's tribe. Each time one of them goes, I mean, you're like, wow, I really kind of found it very moving. That the whole thing was just really, really good. And what I think also stands out to me is that because Furiosa is such a powerful character, and because she has such a good dynamic with Max, and because she has such a good dynamic with Nux, who's the war boy, I mean, it's just, you know, it's just a very, I think this speaks to multiple different people from different walks of life. And it's just such a good movie.
And just attention to craftsmanship and detail. So, like, you know, there's so many things. So, like, the idea that you would have, basically, they're land pirates.
Yeah.
And the way that they would mount the people in the blood bags, and the people would be on the stilts, and they would basically throw, I guess, these RPG or grenade-tipped lances at the cars, but the cars were armored. When you look at what they're doing, it all makes sense in terms of the vehicle design. Mm-hmm. And then you have the cars that show up. You have, like, the quasi-Jawas who are on motorcycles.
Right.
And, like, that cannot be a mistake.
No.
Like, they're sort of Bedouin, like, raiders. Then you have the cars that look like they're out of Mario Kart.
Right.
And they have the spikes on them.
But it all makes sense.
They made this whole awesome world, and in a lesser writer's hand or director, they would have had all this exposition. Oh, here's why the cars do this. And, for example, like, you know, you and I had talked about this earlier on the phone, because we had to talk about the movie. I was waiting. I had to call up and do my Valhalla Chrome thing. For folks who see the movie, they'll get the joke or the illusion that they're like, they don't explain the geography. Mm-hmm. Everything is so minimalist.
It is.
So this is a world of function. People are valued based on their blood and what their flesh can contribute. And you have like two towns. You have Watertown, you have Bullet Town,
Watertown,
Gastown.
Right? I mean, that's it. Yeah.
You have the main encampment. They don't have elaborate names for things. There's no exposition. Mm-hmm. And the people from those other communities just show up. And there are all these like neat details where they basically went to an S&M leather store and stole and bought everything they had.
Right.
Like, why are the characters wearing nipple clamps? Why do these characters have 6 nipples? Are they incestuous? Are they married? And they never explain what the people are dying of. Mm-hmm. Is it incest? Is it radiation poisoning? Is it leukemia? We just don't know, and that's just the world.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. I mean, one of the things that I think is really interesting is that, like, obviously if you look at older Mad Max movies and stuff, that, you know, the budgets were low, so as a result, they kind of, cannibalized what they could from various things. So sometimes you see them wearing hockey gear or rugby gear or whatever. They're wearing stuff, you know, with the idea that basically in a post-apocalyptic future, we just throw this stuff on. This movie kind of takes that and kind of ups it. Because this has a budget, I mean, you can actually look at people and look at the way they're dressed or look at the way what's around them. And they actually tell stories, just that alone. I mean, there's still people in the middle of the swampy area that used to be the Greenland or something, whatever.
And there's no explanation.
There's no explanation for it. But it's not necessary, because you understand that obviously these people are adapting or trying to adapt to a world that's gone completely off the rails. As you said, land pirates. But I mean, the reality is that when human life is worth so little, is it any wonder that, like, you get religious cults, you know, arising where people are willing to sacrifice themselves? Or I don't remember exactly what he said, but basically,
what does he say? Don't become water is weakness. Don't become dependent on water, which is basically him saying ration your life.
Right.
Have no joy. Water is weakness, but he controls the water.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many just really good quotes in this movie too, and unfortunately they all happen so fast. But I remember the one was like Chrome Riders to Valhalla or something, and like, yep. You know, it's just really, you know.
And then like when they jump from one card to the other, it's like Chrome is life, Chrome is God, Chrome is permanent.
Like I live, I die, I live again.
Yep. Oh my God. And the dialogue is believable that these zealots who are in this broken world, who are willing to do anything for their living Godhead, would follow through on his commands. And there's another, I mean, I was just smiling in these moments, because great film, great cinema is made in the small moments, like those moments of silence or those moments of affirmation. So they're doing the car chase, because again, the movie is just an extended car chase. You know, the MacGuffin are the sex slaves. That could be anything. It's
Right.
Indy's, is gold in Indy's box. It's the Ark of the Covenant. Who cares what the MacGuffin is? It's, in Pulp Fiction.
Right.
It's Ving Rhames' soul in the suitcase. Whatever it is, it doesn't matter. It animates the plot. Where one of his war boys jumps over there, the main character, Nux, right? That's his name? Yeah.
Yeah, Nux, yeah.
Jumps over to try to get Max and get the truck, and he messes up and drops the gun or the explosives. And then the leader says, he's like, mediocre. Like, he blesses him, and then looks and shakes his head and says, mediocre.
Right.
And drives away in that badass car.
Well, that's why I think Nux is such an interesting character, because, I mean, there's a moment where, like, basically, he keeps trying to sacrifice himself, kamikaze, and he keeps failing. And,
he wants martyrdom.
Right, and the thing is, he keeps saying, like, witness me, look at what I'm doing, I've been given a chance, to do this, and to see that character go through that arc is really fascinating. And like I said, I mean, Furiosa, I can't say enough about her. She's just an amazing character. The thing is, like, you get enough about her backstory to kind of understand where she's coming from, but it's like it gets the high points and then doesn't worry about the low points. Filmatically, he does that also with the scenes. If the scene is just a setup, he doesn't cover it. Max knocks out a vehicle in an important scene. It doesn't explain how he does it. I mean, he just does it because it's necessary in order to move forward. Similarly, George Miller's using like this fast-paced, like, rapid film quality, in the scenes that just need to happen to move on to the next part. It's just, but what it does, it gives you this intensity to the scenes and makes it even more dramatic. And it also kind of harkens back to the B-movie quality that kind of Mad Max Road Warrior had. I think maybe Thunderdome kind of lost a bit. All
these characters have backstories. So my favorite moment in the film, there's so many, never mind the car chases, the minimal use of CGI, except for the end, it's pretty obvious. The way the monster trucks go over all the debris, the way that, these are professional drivers doing ridiculous things with cars. If folks thought the Fast and Furious, that was some car stuff, forget it.
Yeah.
Fast and Furious is grade school compared to Mad Max. He probably has one of the best stunt drivers in the world on this. So my favorite character his name is the Doof Warrior.
The Doof Warrior.
And he's the dude playing the flamethrower with the heavy metal guitar.
Oh, yeah. That was awesome.
And apparently he has a backstory, so folks should go out and get the comic books. I'm an advocate of physical comic books. You should read your comic books, not download them, but that's just me. So his name is the Doof Warrior, and he has a backstory, and George Miller apparently did an interview where he said, and I'm reading this, verbatim, this is from bloodydisgusting.com. So it says, George Miller said, one character who didn't get his own comic was the Doof Warrior. And I want to tell a story about him in a comic if there's an opportunity. For me, it was all about how someone who was blind, because I didn't get that he was blind, survives in this place. How does someone weak survive the apocalypse? He survived because he was blind, because he lived deep in an unlit mine where it was an advantage to be blind. So deep in the mine, he would sit there and eat rodents and get the water from the seabed, and would also play his guitar where no one could hear it. So one day, a Morton Joe comes by, and someone heard the music. Then he was called upon when Joe needed a bugler or the bagpipe. Someone who helps call everyone to war. And that's what you were saying earlier. We're like, there's a lot of precedence. This is his war wagon, his chariot. So, and Miller does something so cool here as well with sort of, the grammar of film and breaking the fourth wall, where instead of having a soundtrack play, and everybody's sort of, nodding their head to the heavy metal soundtrack, he has the soundtrack in the movie.
It's really, really, it's impressive. Like I said, I can't say enough about it. It's just really impressive. I do want to say one thing, though. Something that I think really bothered me. The only thing that bothered me has nothing to do with the movie. It has to do with people's reactions to the movie. Mm-hmm. And so, there's this whole group of people, like men's rights activists who basically...
The testicularly, fortitudinally challenged?
Yeah.
And the challenged by common sense and intelligence as well?
Right, basically, yeah. And they're kind of like saying, well, Furiosa, is shown to be a better character than Max, and so as a result, we're going to boycott the movie or some stupid thing like that. It's not true at all. They complement each other. People have a problem with characters who complement each other, then they really kind of do betray their own stupidity.
Well, and that's where their bigotry and shallowness and short-sightedness and profound ignorance comes in. Because how many movies where, if we're thinking about the Bechdel test, using that as an example, where the male characters are so much more fully developed than the female characters. I don't hear them complaining about this.
Right.
About that. These are old-fashioned, ignorant patriarchs who are so profoundly insecure in a world oriented around male advantage and privilege that a movie puts them into a tizzy. I joked on Twitter. I was like, these men rights knuckleheads.
Yeah.
They're really upset because you have a female lead who has more testosterone than they do.
Right. Well, that's the thing. It's not just the Bechdel test that I think that this movie obviously passes. with flying color. The idea that Furiosa, you can flip the gender of any character in this, and the whole thing still makes sense. Like, just like Lord of the Rings, you can switch the gender of Frodo, and it still is completely fine. That, to me, is extremely important. The fact that you're representing these actual, really people put in these awful, crazy situations. When you have fully rounded out, fleshed out characters that make sense, you get a better product. I mean, I wish that more writers in Hollywood and more directors would use this as an example of what happens when you actually have really good characters. You can have good characters in action movies. Amazing. Yep. Who thought? You know, I mean, we've always known that, but for whatever reason, they just refuse to give us that.
So, you know, all the characters, and that's a really good point. You could swap out the genders of any of these characters and the film still works.
Exactly, yeah.
And again, in a lesser talented person's hands, someone who gave in to studio pressure, someone who gave in to horrible, I hate when you go to the movies and the screenings and they give you the surveys.
Right.
These audience-crafted horrible films. And of course we can know about, you know, the big old Hollywood system certainly did that in its own way. Mm-hmm. But in a lesser filmmaker's hand, you know they would have had something where Furiosa gets together with Mad Max and there's some sort of tender moment of sex or a kiss.
Right.
And they would have totally ruined it.
The only other movie that I can think of that has the same type of common sense approach, not only, you know, to gender, but also just to story, Furiosa really is, she carries the movie. But like I said at the beginning, Mad Max is whose eyes we look through.
So, of course, we could talk forever about Mad Max, because there's so much to discuss here. Articles will be written, books will be written. They have comic books, fiction, there will be nonfiction, exegesis and analyses of the film. But as we wind down, I think one of my highest compliments, as likely as yours too, is, would we give George Miller a Star Wars movie? And if so, what type of Star Wars movie would it be? Because my answer is enthusiastic, yes. I'd love to see what he does in the universe.
Yeah, I would too.
But would it just be like a Rogue Squadron movie? Would it be a chase or a heist movie? Because I just want to see what that sort of frenetic madness does with Star Wars.
I'd like to see him do whatever he wanted to do, to tell you the truth. I mean, you know, basically give him a blank check, because I think that's the type of thing that, you know, he does the best.
Yeah, because he's done Babe, he's done Lorenzo's Oil, he can tell stories.
Yeah. I mean, and that's the thing. I mean, you know, he's the type of director. He did Witches of Eastwick, too, I think.
Oh, he did, yep.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I mean, so he's just the type of director who's just as comfortable with action as he is with actual, you know, deep plot. And I think that really says a lot about him as an artist, but also the type of people who he surrounds himself with.
If they're willing to play with it, give him an Old Republic movie.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to see that.
Everything comes back to Star Wars always, because the Force connects us all. It binds us, it penetrates us. Luminous beings are we, not this crude matter. But we both enthusiastically give Mad Max Fury Road 2 thumbs up to channel the late, great Ebert and Siskel.
I would definitely give it 2 thumbs up.
So, folks, better beat your feet. Go see Mad Max. I didn't bring my drinking flask as promised to Mad Max because my day went crazy. But when I see it a second time and a third time, and I want to see it in IMAX 3D if I can find a showing, it's a movie that just has to be seen to be believed. It's just literally that good.
Yeah, I would completely agree. And you know, like I said, it is something that I need to see again.
So on that note, Bill the Lizard. But as always, thanks for sitting down and chatting about all matters geekly and important here on the podcast known as the Chauncey DeVega Show. And you have to make sure that you come back again.
Yeah, thank you.
Always a pleasure to sit down with Bill the Lizard and talk about geekly matters. But in all seriousness, great conversation and sharing there. I think Bill is spot on. Mad Max is a legend. And if you listen to the interviews that George Miller has so generously done with many media outlets, and he doesn't seem like somebody just obligatorily doing stuff. He seems like he really likes this. And how can you not respect somebody who takes 30-some years to make their vision come true? You have to see this movie. You just have to see it to develop your own opinion because it's going to be that important. It's just wonderful. It's absolutely wonderful. And I hope they make video games. I hope they come up with some good old-fashioned pen and paper role-playing games for this fully realized universe. And Max is a legend. He is Robin Hood. He is Yojimbo. He is the man with no name. And there are a few cinematic movie-going experiences that I can recall in recent memory where I can say I was totally lost. And that's, of course, added to by my own personal experience with injury and pain and damn near broken leg. To be able to tell if I have kids or grandkids, yeah, I was there with a busted up leg, and it was that awesome. So go and surrender to the chrome, to Valhalla. I have lived, I have died, I will live again. Whew. David Krugler is cool folk, super smart, super entertaining, very engaging. He teaches at the University of Wisconsin. He's the author of books about the Cold War and civil defense. His new book is 1919, The Year of Racial Violence. And we as I say, we get in the car and we go for a ride. And we talk and we dialogue and we talk about masculinity and resistance, the Black freedom struggle, the Cold War, identity. And we even sort of do the what if we could make these wonderful moments of African American resistance. One of the things we also talk about is, why is this hidden history? Why are folks afraid to talk about African American resistance in the context of American politics, life, society, and culture? Who is afraid of this narrative? Because for me growing up, because I was blessed with great teachers, white, black, brown, red, yellow, and other, who told me that our people resisted. They told me about human struggle and human dignity. And my godparents who got me that great book, The Black Book, where I read about the Harlem Hellfighters and read about African Americans who were participating in Maroonage, maroon colonies. I learned about our resistance in Haiti, Toussaint de Louverture, great black and brown folk who formed quilombos in Brazil and Suriname, who fought back. That for a lot of our young brothers and sisters and our white brothers who need to understand this too, we always fought back. It's a human struggle of dignity and resistance. So he and I try to figure out, why are these histories not told? Why are they buried and hidden in the popular American imagination? So David Krugler and I chop it up. Great conversation. As I always say, if you like what we're doing here on the podcast known as the Chauncey DeVega Show, if you can, tweet, share, download, subscribe to us on iTunes, Stitcher, and elsewhere. Tell your friends on Facebook, because that will help to create opportunities. And as I always say again, if you like what we're doing, right-hand sidebar, if you can click on the PayPal link, throw a penny in, 10 cents, 50, $1. Throw some ducats, because, you know, we don't advertise. I get opportunities all the time. And we do a fundraiser twice a year. So next month, we got our fundraiser, folk. So hands are going to be open. The begging bowl will be out there. So if you can, either throw some change in now or throw some change in later, it would be greatly, greatly appreciated, because this does take time and energy and resources and opportunity costs. Every episode probably takes about 3 or 4 hours to put together. So if you like what we're doing, and if you can, throw some change in. Segment number 2 in this overstuffed, wonderful podcast of Mad Mex goodness, Chauncey DeVega's story of going down in the street and busting up his leg, and now a tale of African-American resistance and struggle and human dignity with Dr. David Krugler, author of 1919, The Year of Racial Violence. That's coming up next.
And there's some long kills in my hands that make me feel so bad. Sometimes even want to cry. And there's some feelings in my head that make me feel so sad.
David, how are you doing this afternoon?
I'm doing well. Thanks for asking, Chauncey.
Yeah, I just want to extend a great thanks. I know you just came off of a book tour. We're going to be talking about your great work about the Cold War and African-American resistance and the Black freedom struggle. So I'm so very excited. That's a topic we've returned to quite a few times on the podcast here, and I got some great folks coming up. So you'll be in good company. And when I reached out to you, I was like, I have to get David to come on the show. So I was so happy when you said yes. So you just came off a book tour. What was that like?
Well, it was great. I got out to Washington, D.C., a favorite city of mine, and I was pleased that the Historical Society of Washington, which is D.C.'s equivalent of a state historical society, partnered up with a great independent bookstore out there called Busboys and Poets, a reference there to how Langston Hughes got his start as a poet. And actually, the location I was at is on the honorary Langston Hughes Way. On 14th and V in Washington. And Busboys and Poets also has a partnership with a nonprofit called Teaching for Change, which tries to bring social justice issues to the classroom. So I was working with 3 great organizations, and they did a lot of publicity. They really got the word out, and on a very cold Monday night in February with lots of other things to do in Washington, we got around 20, 25 people out there to hear about the book. So I was really pleased.
And what were some of the questions that folks asked?
I got questions about the number of African-American women who took up arms to resist mob violence. I got a question about the future, which I suppose as a historian I should expect, because after all, don't we tell our students we learn the past so we can shape the events to come? And it proved to be a difficult question for me to answer, because I didn't think I could say America's where it needs to be at fully. As a historian, I said, we've come a long way from 1919, but this questioner really wanted me to say to offer some thoughts on whether the structural problems that had led to this mob violence and the ways in which African Americans were fighting for democracy after World War I, whether that would ever be obtained. And I found that a really thought-provoking and in some ways discouraging question because I couldn't provide a decisive and optimistic answer.
I mean, isn't it hard to tell the truth sometimes?
Yes.
You know, you have folk who are hungry for knowledge and inspiration, and they want that gratifying post-civil rights, post-racial America answer. But as you and I know, and the listeners to the show know, and folks who thought about justice and human rights along the color line, is that this is a centuries-long battle. And white supremacy and racism are modern inventions. Man made these concepts and these theories and, you know, created the state around, in the West at least, around that concept. And we would think that man and humankind can unmake it rather easily. But it's not a knot that you can just untie. And I'm thinking at this point, it's not even controversial to talk about the quote unquote new Jim and Jane Crow, but I mean about systemic, top to bottom racism. And it's about race and class. I mean, that's another important element here. Race is how class has lived in America. Discrimination against black and brown folk in the criminal justice system. And I was thinking too about your book and about the talk you gave. I mean, this is, like I said, you know, we sit down at the virtual bar and go where we may and work from notes. I always tell folk when they email me, they're like, how do you do a podcast? I'm like, well, find interesting people and have something to say and sit down and talk to folk. Thinking about this question about African American resistance in the New World and the West more generally, but in particular in the United States, I'm astounded that there have not been more instances in cases of martial resistance, organized martial resistance against a racial state. And we'll talk about, you know, the long history of black armed resistance in this country and civil disobedience and also working within, I'm surprised, like I said, working with the state, trying to access the liberal polity to create social change. But I mean, when you're doing your book and answering folks' questions, I mean, did that come up?
It comes up a lot. I think people instinctively want to believe that direct action was taken to resist and repel this kind of violence and for people to defend themselves. And I was surprised by the amount of resistance I found. I mean, I got into the topic because I knew it was there and I wanted to learn more. And I felt that this was a neglected part of a much studied topic, the year of racial violence in 1919. And as I did my research, I found that, yes, there has been a lot of resistance during Reconstruction.
That's right.
I mean, historians and students of history are familiar with the ways in which black male suffrage was rolled back and how political terrorism flourished in order to deny a full reconstruction of the country and creation of full freedom. But I didn't know about the Union League, which was formed by freedmen and freedwomen who supported men taking up arms and undertaking paramilitary training. And one wonders if a lot of them had military experience from the war. They resisted Klan efforts to disrupt black Republican political activity.
When you're doing your research about, you know, African American resistance in the United States, there's that long continuity, and folks who follow the, you know, historians and other social scientists, political scientists who follow the black freedom struggle. I mean, one of the big debates in social movement theory is, okay, how do you date and periodize, you know, the black freedom struggle? Did it start the minute the first African American was brought to this country and the assertion of black folks as chattel in the 17th century? Or do you periodize it by thinking about, you know, the civil rights movement, World War I, World War II, the Double V campaign, the Civil War, abolition, et cetera, and so on? And I've always been of the school that resistance began the first time you had bonded labor in this country. And that African American resistance and our freedom struggle has been one of the continuities of American history. It's not an aberration. But as a historian and as someone who's talked to students about these topics, doing your own intellectual work, why do you think there's that historical erasure? That sort of, you know, is it just about, you know, racial memory and that black folks and brown folk know that we resisted and fought back, but the idea of black servitude does a certain amount of cultural and political work in this country?
I think one of the reasons for that is the compartmentalization of major periods in U.S. history, particularly at the secondary level and at the university level. And I hold myself and my fellow academics responsible for this as much as in the secondary education fields. We have so little time to teach so much that we create neat little stories that are discrete and sometimes self-contained. So we have the Civil War. We have the end of slavery. We touch upon a little bit of Reconstruction. And then the next time African American history and the freedom struggle gets full attention is after World War II, when we pick up with Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King. When I teach African American history, I ask my students what they've been taught about African American history. And one of the most memorable responses I got was from a young woman who said, well, we learned that there was slavery, it was bad, so the Civil War was fought and it ended, and then 100 years later there was a civil rights movement. And I think that really boils down to one sentence: the way in which introductory history is taught, even at the collegiate level. And we need to spend a lot more time taking these chapters out of their self-contained environment and saying, from the moment Africans were brought in bondage to British North America, the freedom struggle was underway. And it's part and parcel of U.S. history. One way I try to do this is by teaching the drafting of the U.S. Constitution and showing the students how slavery was like this black hole that pulled everything in the Constitution toward it, but you can never see it. You can't see this force because slavery isn't identified in the Constitution, and there's elliptical language used to protect it.
All other people.
Right. And even like in later articles, there's this boilerplate about nothing can be changed in this Constitution, which is a reference to date set for the end of the slave trade. So even at that point, the drafters are thinking, well, we've got to make sure we don't allow a change to this date at which the slave trade will be ended.
How do you respond? I mean, it's so timely you brought up the Constitution, because I was just teaching the Constitution 2 weeks ago in a survey course. And I'm always astounded. And, of course, the racial optics are there. So you have a black lecturer with predominantly white class talking about American mythology and American exceptionalism and a sacred document. And I always, use some of Dahl's work, his new book about the American Constitution, and Lonnie Guinier as well, to sort of rethink the Constitution. And I point out a basic fact that the Constitution is a political document. It's a negotiated solution. It's trying to solve practical problems. It's the rules of the game. And it's a pro-slavery, pro-Southern document. And that basic fact seems astounding to so many students. And I'm just, it's the year 2015. Why do you think there's so much pushback against that?
Well, I think the source of the pushback is American exceptionalism and also a belief in progress as time goes by. And also the worship of the founders. And there's so much to admire about the founders. And they've accomplished so much. And the Constitution, though a flawed document and a pro-slavery document, did contain the seeds of its own solution, though it took the Civil War to do that. But I think we want to believe that it was a perfect document from the get-go, and that it didn't require anything more than tinkering around the edges, amendments to follow, and that there couldn't be something embedded within it, along with its genius, that was also potentially destructive, which was the failure to resolve slavery and freedom in one document at the time of ratification.
History is a moving train, as I'm so fond of saying. I think that was a Howard Zinn quote. But again, like that belief in progress, and also too the sort of odd American worshipfulness of its own mythic past. And I'm sure, that's a function of nationalism. I'm sure most countries probably do that. But you have that American exceptionalism. But America is a young country without history, but it selectively remembers and forgets. And just thinking about the Tea Party types, right? In Oklahoma and Texas, trying to rewrite school curriculums to not talk about the quote unquote bad things like slavery. It's utterly Orwellian, and it just really makes you wonder about the types of citizens and critical thinkers that are being produced by our school systems. What are some other objections too? Because I'm thinking about the Constitution again. Like, why do you think in the year 2015 that there's this cult of deification around the framers? Because I don't call them the founders. They're the framers. They were people. They had conflicting political interests. They were rich, right? As I joked, the folks on Maury Povich weren't ratifying the Constitution. We had a constitutional convention today. They had class interests, and they were slave owners. Is it just, like I said, sort of that, American exceptionalism lie that's taught from elementary school and recirculated through the public, that you have people who would be angry if you said, yeah, TJ and George Washington were the two biggest slave owners in the country, and that slavery was the foundation of American wealth?
I think people don't want to hear that. I think they want to believe such unpleasant, if very real, aspects of history can be set aside, neglected, even forgotten, because it's no longer relevant. And of course, as a historian and as a scholar, I like to think that my work and my teaching shows how there are these vestiges, or how slavery led to the sort of white supremacy that caused a great deal of violence in 1919. And if we accept we take your great metaphor of history as a moving train, well, we have to follow that trajectory, that journey. And when we simply wipe out parts of our past, we run the risk of becoming Orwellian, of becoming a nation that follows propaganda rather than follows history.
You know, we're at the 100th anniversary of World War I, and World War I is one of my hobby interests is a wannabe military grognard type. So I picked something, I was like, wow, I'm interested in social history. I started watching Boardwalk Empire, and then thinking about, again, Boardwalk Empire, which was a great show. I don't know if you've had a chance to watch it on HBO, in terms of dealing with race, class, gender, sexuality, the post-World War I years, prohibition, and so on. You just learn so much about this hidden history because, again, it's not well taught in our schools. World War I was a European war. And thinking about how World War I was also the crucible for the making of whiteness and how so many white ethnics earned their whiteness in the World War I years, never mind the African-American freedom struggle. Why do you think 1919 and World War I more generally, especially along the color line, has sort of been thrown down the memory hole for a lot of people?
Well, I think because there's so much attention to in the United States, in terms of studying World War I and its aftermath, there's so much attention given to Wilson's fight for the League of Nations and his attempts to fulfill his vision to make the world safe for democracy. And you have a great deal of political drama, of course, the showdown in the Senate and the reservationists and the irreconcilables and Wilson's stubbornness and the outcome in which the U.S. doesn't even sign the Versailles Treaty, let alone join the League of Nations. And I think that tends to get the focus. There's also a lot of other things in 1919 that get attention. The domestic terrorist bombings that took place from anarchists, and you have strikes, including a police strike in Boston. And so it's easy to focus on those moments and to see them as separate moments or events rather than all part of some seismic change taking place as a result of that global war.
And then you have, again, sort of internal migration. You have the transition from a rural to an urban country. You have African Americans escaping the tyranny of the white supremacist South. You have all these other related social changes. And thinking about, that bloody summer, that red summer of 1919, sort of crystallizing it down for folk who may not be familiar with that history, what caused these, this national spate of white on black racial pogroms and violence from Florida to Chicago to DC to East St. Louis, of course, talking about Tulsa? Was it just an effort to reassert white male dominance in the context of the post-World War I years and these anxieties about black folk quite literally being too uppity? Because that was the language that was used, right? Reasserting the social order after sort of Theodore Roosevelt's appeals to the new Americanism and talking about the melting pot and black folks and others showing that they were true men through military service. I mean, what was that moment that set off that spark, that explosion all over the country?
I think it was what you just described, the reassertion of the structure and practice and ideology of white supremacy, particularly male-dominated white supremacy. But there are several other factors as well. The New Negro movement was well underway before the war, though we typically associate the New Negro movement with the Harlem Renaissance and as a cultural and artistic flourishing. Its origins were political and ideological and had some radical elements to it. The socialist Hubert Harrison, for example, is a prominent voice of the New Negro movement prior to World War I, and he's an early advocate of armed self-defense. That provides a basis for African Americans, men and women, to organize and to understand how they're going to contribute to the war effort with an expectation that in addition to making the world safe for democracy, they're going to make America safe for democracy. And the juxtaposition of the two is seen very neatly in two quotes. The first from W.E.B. Du Bois, who had an officer commission in the U.S. Army during World War I and famously and controversially called on African Americans to close ranks, to set aside calls for reform and grievances, with the expectation that there would be change after the war. In May of 1919, writing in The Crisis, he said, it's time to make America fulfill its democratic promise. This nation lynches us, it robs us, it insults us, it's taken our right to vote away. But we're going to save democracy in America as we saved it in France by the great Jehovah, or we will know the reason why. And almost as a direct response, Representative Jimmy Burns, Democrat of South Carolina, said in the House of Representatives on the floor of Congress, and I'll paraphrase. I mean, this is pretty close to the quote. There are 90 million white people in this nation who are determined not to grant social and political equality to the 10 million Negroes. And the war has not changed in any way this position. So there's the clash, the reassertion, but also the continuation of the New Negro movement and earlier efforts in the freedom struggle to perfect democracy and win voting rights and equal opportunity in all spheres.
I mean, it also makes me think, too, about the many paradoxes of democracy and freedom, even going back to our conversation about the Constitution, that America is a hair-and-vote society, and that historically white male freedom and independence was defined precisely by the oppression and denial of those same liberties and virtues to people of color. So it's a zero-sum game, right? So you have folks who are like, okay, we can't allow black folks to have freedom, have full freedom and full citizenship, because that is taking away from the privileges of whiteness. And that when you have a moment where democracy is racialized, you have the necessary exclusion of whole groups of people to validate the freedom and liberty of the in-group. And that's always fascinated me, as I said, going all the way back to the Constitution. Thinking about, the slave owners necessarily didn't see any contradiction. Many of them in their private journals and diaries write about it. But the framers really didn't see a contradiction between the rhetoric of freedom and democracy and owning human beings as property. And then thinking about the Bloody Summer, the Red Summer, and thinking again about America's culture of martial virtue, of gun ownership, of military service. So you have a whole population, black folks historically and other people of color throughout the country's history understood, just like white ethnics, that was a way to earn Americanness. But for black and brown folk, your skin color is a liability, and you're going to be punished for exhibiting those same qualities.
Right. And during the war, there were numerous, practically uncountable attempts to segregate, diminish, limit, and subordinate black military service. And this manifested itself in small ways and large ways. The large ways, of course, the use of segregated units. Small ways, forcing black officers to eat with black enlisted men, right, which white officers didn't have to do, segregating officers' quarters. One commander of a black unit, Colonel Glendy Young, told another officer, a white officer, I wouldn't make one of these black sons of bitches an officer if I didn't have to. And that's a direct quote. There was also a complaint from an officer about the assignment of the Colored National Guard of the District of Columbia, a separate battalion, so a segregated National Guard unit, to guard the White House prior to the U.S. entry into the war. This officer did not like the sight of black men in uniform doing what was mostly a ceremonial guard duty around the White House. And I think the symbolism of that complaint, that resentment, shows these issues very vividly.
I didn't know about the D.C. example there with the National Guard unit, because that gets us, again, right to the present with Barack Obama and these deep historical anxieties, quite literally about the black body and the black body and the white body politic. And that it's as much about substantive issues of political disagreement at times as it is quite literally about that symbolism of a black soldier in a uniform would be lynched, because that's irreconcilable with the white gaze of that era of this hair-and-vote America, or that you'd have a black man and his family in the White House. For unfortunately, way too many of our white brothers and sisters on the other side of the political aisle, and even some conservative Democrats to a lesser degree, that's revolutionary. That is simply unconscionable, even if they don't have the language to describe it. And unfortunately, quite a few of them do. I mean, just turn on Fox News or go on right-wing political websites. You can see that overt language, the embrace of the Confederate flag, the language of nullification and secession. But thinking about D.C., I remember my father, folks who listen to the podcast here, ChaunceyDeVega.com, the Chauncey DeVega Show, they love, I don't know if they love or they find it annoying. I'm always sharing, again, sort of family history and family stories. I have a dear friend of mine who actually did my family's genealogy. So he's going to come on later on in another episode and sort of talk about sort of family myths and truths. Because whenever you do your genealogy, for folks out there, you always discover something is a lie. And you may discover some interesting things that are true. But I remember talking to my dad, who served in World War II. He's a lot older than my mother. And he had stories about being in the segregated military. He was black but could pass for white, and he served in a white unit. But the way they did the draft, it was people from your neighborhood. So all these Irish and Italian and Polish guys knew he was black, but they also knew him, so they didn't out him. But he was talking about, he was in Texas, going to the movie theater that was segregated and sitting up in what was called the buzzard's nest. And he and his friend got drunk one day and shot holes in the movie screen because they were just angry at all the racism among the folk in the public there. And he and I were talking one day, and I don't know if it was about the military or about World War II and civil rights. And I was like, yeah, wouldn't it be something if more black folk fought back? And he's like, what are you talking about? He's like, we always fought back. And he was telling me stories that he had heard about African Americans in World War I, or shortly thereafter, actually fighting in the streets against white racial rioters and the pogroms all across this country, and how black servicemen and other veterans set up bunkers, they set up roadblocks, and they actually fought back. And I remember that was such a revelation to me. And now later on, some 20 years later, I'm like, duh, people resist. People fight back. The subaltern rises up. So what were some of those similar stories that you uncovered in terms of your own research where you just were smiling or shocked or surprised?
Well, I can give you several stories that illustrate exactly what your father told you about 2 decades ago. Let's go to Knoxville, which had a pretty serious race riot. And just a quick side note on terminology. This is something I point out in the book. I use race riot for stylistic purposes, just simpler and evocative and much more common. But a more accurate term is anti-black collective violence, because when we talk about these riots, in almost every instance, they were initiated by white mobs and targeted African Americans. So Knoxville had an outbreak of anti-black collective violence Labor Day weekend, 1919. A young black resident was accused of attacking and killing a white woman. Let there be no doubt he was innocent of this crime. But while he was jailed, a lynch mob formed. The sheriff took him out of town secretly, but the crowd outside the courthouse didn't know this, and they stormed it and wrecked it and freed white prisoners, not black prisoners. And then, after the 4th Tennessee Infantry was called in to restore order, the mob turned on the black residents of Knoxville. And they were actually accompanied by the infantry, because some of the first white rioters came back and told the infantry, well, we're being attacked by blacks. You have to come restore order. You've got to stop them. So during this gun battle, in which African Americans were fighting the white mob, and then also members of the Tennessee 4th Infantry, barricades were set up. A veteran of the Spanish-American War by the name of Joe Etter lost his life, and although conflicts accounts conflict, it seems pretty clear that he lost his life because he was trying to stop gunfire, including possibly machine gun fire, being trained on black defenders of the neighborhood. They were able to keep this mob from running amok in the black neighborhood of Knoxville. Although Tulsa's 2 years later, it seems that the purpose of this mob was to carry out something like what happened in Tulsa. So there's one example. The second example I'll provide comes from Chicago, perhaps the most well-known race riot of 1919. There, members of the 370th Regiment, 93rd Division, which had been, prior to the war, the 8th Illinois National Guard, an all-black unit. Members of that unit, veterans, put on their uniforms. Some of them even put on their croix de guerres they had received for their service in France from the French military. And they took up arms to patrol the streets because the police had proved unable to protect African Americans from white mob attacks.
And unwilling.
And unwilling, in many instances unwilling. There was a strategic mistake by the chief of police, John Garrity. He thought he could just set up a cordon around the Black Belt, around segregated Chicago on the south side. And the problem with that was it left all African Americans outside of the cordon vulnerable to attack. And these were people who had to go to work. They were on streetcars going to the stockyards, and they were attacked by white mobs. It didn't do anything for African Americans who had found a way out of the crowded Black Belt and had moved into the borderlands, neighborhoods like Canaryville and Bridgeport. And one of the purposes of white gang activity in Chicago was to drive out those families from those homes. So a lot of people were left vulnerable. The police were unable to restore order because of the chief's decision, and there's a lot of documentation that the police were abetting the gang activity because there were a lot of familial and ethnic ties in those neighborhoods between police and the fathers of some of these young men and even the young men themselves.
And as I said, I'm so appreciative of you pointing that out because, I mean, you read my mind. Because in the common vernacular, riot is a racialized term. And it's commonly associated with black uprisings in the 1960s. But the word really didn't take on that meaning historically in this country. It usually meant white folks attacking blacks. And then somehow it became twisted in sort of these more recent historical moments as well with the LA uprisings. But thinking about the idea and like what folks who, social theorists and others who study mob violence and group psychology and intergroup conflict, why do you think there's this sort of mythology that these riots that you're talking about and other moments of interracial violence are spontaneous? Because my understanding of the Bloody Summer and other white-on-black racial pogroms is that these were not necessarily planned activities, but there's a long history of them. And they're a lot less spontaneous than they seem. And you have white elites and others actively strategizing how to drive black and brown folks out of communities, how to take land. Never mind, there's a great documentary called Banished. I don't know if you had a chance to see it. It was on PBS. And it's an African-American historian, I believe. He's a historian and journalist. And he's doing his family history. And one of the dirty secrets of the great outmigration from the South, and just had a great report on lynching that just came out a few weeks ago from the EQI, that a lot of the great migration was driven by fear of white racial terrorism and by land theft and by denial of job opportunities. So this brother goes to Florida and he's like, I want to go see where my grandparents came from, because no one ever talks about the Great Migration. And he goes down there with the help of this white journalist. They start doing some research and discover that in that small county in Florida, quite literally, the white folk in the town went to every black home and put up posters on the door and said, if you're not out of the town by 24 hours or the next day at 2 p.m. or whatever, we're going to kill you and you're going to be lynched. And you had this huge outmigration. So you had a lot of this violence was actively planned land theft.
Yeah, and that was not uncommon at the time. One of the underappreciated, or I should say understudied, elements of the history of white supremacy and racial terror in the United States is banishment and exile. And as I was doing the research for the book, I was struck by how often some of these instances were preceded by leaders of the white community ordering a so-called troublemaker to leave town and given such an option, or actually driven out of town. And if there was a refusal to do so, then organized mob violence was the next step. This led to anti-black collective violence in Longview, Texas, which was so well organized and had such a murderous intent, although it didn't result, fortunately, in a lot of deaths, that it's not too much of a claim to call it a pogrom. But there, a local black teacher, who was also a news agent for the Chicago Defender, was accused of writing an article that appeared in the early July edition of the Defender that said a man had been lynched in Longview, a black man, because he had a white girlfriend, and that this woman wanted to be with him, and that if they were up north, their love could blossom. And the brothers of this woman attacked the news agent and teacher, a man by the name of S.L. Jones, and he was ordered to leave town. And when his friend, a local physician, the black doctor in town, went to the local leaders, the white leaders, to find out what sort of protection would be offered to him, he found they were actually organizing the lynch mob. And at that point, he walked out and said, because they told him to take off his hat, and he lost his temper and said, yes, that's all you say to a colored man when he comes to talk business with you, take off your hat. So he had just had it with even this slight but very significant demand of recognition of inferiority on his part. And he went back and organized a paramilitary force that drove away the lynch mob, and then led to thousands of white men in Gregg County, the county in which Longview is located, coming to town early that morning to carry out much more sustained reprisals.
We were talking earlier about being old men on the porch who are Luddites yelling at the young kids about reading books on their iPads and digital devices. The internet, right, is a device for actually doing some great archival research. I mean, the ability to actually find some of these documents. So I did a basic search about a month or two ago because I was fascinated by this language in the American media, in particular among the right-wing media during Ferguson, about black folks rioting and uprising. And I was like, wow, that language is old language. It comes up all the time. So I did, New York Times archive search, and I just typed in Negro uprisings or uprisings. And it's fascinating that you see the same narrative tropes where it's about black disrespect, quote unquote, rape, of course, black folks, stepping out of bounds, black on white disrespect. That language comes up all the time. And then, of course, in that 19th and early 20th century yellow journalistic language, which I love, then it becomes a panic. And then you have the white folks in arms trying to defend their honor and their women, and then sending out for help because there's rumors of Negro guerrillas, not, the ape gorilla, but the other gorilla. And I'm sure they would have said that as well. Running amok in the wilderness, and we need to call out the state police, and we need ammunition to put them down. And it's scary, but it's also fascinating how that language is still with us.
Yeah, I think we want to believe there was all this talk when Barack Obama was elected about being in a post-racial society. And as a historian, I had a lot of problems with that. I think it's hubris to think we can simply, because of one event, detach ourselves from history. And we are rooted to this history, whether we recognize it or not. And this notion of uprisings and of riots and of threats to the majority group has a long history. In 1919, the bloodiest pogrom, the bloodiest and most violent and deadliest anti-black collective violence occurred in Phillips County, Arkansas. And the report you mentioned earlier from the Equal Justice Initiative now puts the death toll at 237 in Phillips County.
And that's just, as again, always going back to that hidden history and thinking about, again, how our school systems, again, selectively process and present information, and the idea of creating the sort of neoliberal, multicultural corporate democracy, the sort of lies and obfuscations and distortions, and basically, like I said, silencing of the truth. That it's, the truth tellers who are historians, who are digging around in archives, who know this history, and also the idea of thinking about oral traditions and how so many of these stories were passed down within the white community, rather within the black community, I'm sure within the white community, in hushed tones about mass racial violence, lynchings, and so on. But when you have folks who actually say, yeah, this is the truth and this is the history, very often they're shouted down and ignored because, number one, it's uncomfortable. And folks want to hold on to the myth of racial democracy when this quote unquote racial democracy was made and, on the foundation of blood. I think it's Edward Bonilla Silva has this great analogy, and he talks about the lie of the melting pot. And he says, well, if there was a melting pot, it was First Nations people, black folk, Hispanics, Asians, and others who are actually the wood and the kindling for the pot. And it's a frightening visual, but it's so apt and it's so true. And I'm thinking again in visual terms, there's my own cinematic tendencies, but in terms of thinking about your book and your other research about black resistance, if you were going to write the screenplay or the movie, let's say, fingers crossed, they approach you with a sack full of money and they're like, this is an awesome story, Dave. Let's make a movie. Because they're making a movie about the Harlem Hellfighters and it's supposed to star Will Smith. So that'll be interesting to see what they get right and what they get wrong.
Right.
How would you sort of frame the story? What would be the high points? What would be some of the battles and the struggles that you would depict? Some of the personalities?
Well, thinking cinematically, I would like to see a juxtaposition of the combat performance of black units in World War I, particularly the 370th, which did very well, and also the Harlem Hellfighters as well, and sort of juxtapose their performance in combat with what they do back in their hometowns to protect themselves and to protect their communities when authorities fail to do it or even are part of the problem.
Because, that would be the interesting question. So you have these great men who have killed, who are trained killers, who have won, French medals of honor, who are dignified. There's you have African Americans who go to Europe, who are treated with respect and dignity, especially by the French, who are demonstrated their martial prowess. They can walk with their head held high. We have the Double V campaign. They're going to come back home and they're going to be humiliated under Jim and Jane Crow. And what must that have felt like for someone who had that background and those experiences?
Right. There's a great book published in the 1970s by a veteran of World War I who became a communist, and he used the pseudonym Harry Haywood. It's a memoir of a black Bolshevik, I think is the title. And he writes about being a waiter on the Michigan Central Railroad after he was mustered out from his military service. And he was on the train making its regular run from out east back to Chicago when word was received of the riot. And he and other porters aboard the train bought weapons in Detroit. And he joined with other veterans of the 370th to get arms. And now some of the accounts that he provides of what happened haven't been corroborated, but he talks about setting up a machine gun in an apartment at 51st and State, where an attempted incursion by a mob was expected, and that a vigil was kept up to use that weapon, if necessary, against the white mob. As Haywood reports, fortunately for them, they never showed, so he didn't use the weapon. But that would be a great cinematic moment, and that's something that's part of the oral tradition as well. He happened to put this to paper, and it was published in the 1970s, but it sure sounded like a story that he had told before, the way he wrote it.
Makes me think too about the whole controversy about Selma, and I've talked to folks about it and how it depicts, I think, unfairly President Johnson. And I'm always I understand the Hollywood machine. I understand the questions and the choices that documentary filmmakers have to make, folks who are making docudramas. But I always default to real life is 99% of the time more interesting than fiction. And when you discover the real historical record, there are so many stories there that are untold. That would be both pedagogical in terms of educating the public, but also entertaining and inspiring. But I would be amiss if I didn't ask you about sort of your light bulb moment in terms of being a scholar of the Cold War. And of course, I want to talk about that as well. And thinking about sort of the new civil rights scholarship that locates the black freedom struggle within the context of the Cold War, because that's shattering a lot of mythologies too. in terms of how the mass public thinks about the civil rights movement. But how did you make that transition?
Well, that's a great question. I had, as you know, my last book was on a Cold War topic, and I was thinking about what I wanted to do next. And I first wanted to move into a new era, since all my research to that point had been post-World War II and particularly focused on the Cold War. And I've always been fascinated by the World War I era. I'm trained as a diplomatic historian, so as I mentioned earlier, the focus on Woodrow Wilson and the battle for the League of Nations is something that I learned very early on in my training as a historian. And doing more reading on World War I and thinking about, well, what sort of topic can I do? I was drawn to all the turmoil that occurred at the same time the battle for the League of Nations was underway in Washington. And my original idea was to write a narrative, episodic history of 1919. And fortunately for me, though I didn't quite see it this way at the time, right at the moment I was thinking of this idea, a Wall Street Journal reporter turned historian, Anne Hagedorn, published Savage Peace, Hope and Fear in post-war in 1919. Mm-hmm. It's basically a very good narrative episodic history of all the turmoil of 1919. So I said, okay, well, I'm not going to do that. But after reading her book and delving more into the racial violence, I thought, okay, this is what needs to be done.
And was it just literally that light bulb lightning moment, intellectual lightning, or was it, I've always wanted to do this, and here's a hole in the literature, here's a complimentary story, and I'm going to drive a car right through it?
Well, I wish I could say there was an epiphany or that light bulb moment, but I think it was more a gradual awareness, the sort of a very slow dawn of the light coming up and then carrying out the research and finding all of these amazing stories. And certainly there were epiphany moments when I discovered outstanding examples of black self-defense and armed resistance that I had no idea had occurred. So there were many surprises during the research, and that became incentive and inspiration to see this project.
Like, in terms of the research, as I said, I'm always interested in nuts and bolts. Like, did you go to the Schomburg? Did you go to private university archives? Did you collect diaries? Did you interview people? I mean, how did you discover this hidden history?
I used some diaries. One in particular that was very helpful was in an unusual place, but I was lucky that the archivist at Marquette University at the time let me know about the existence of a memoir a Chicagoan named Arthur Falls had left to the university. As a young man, Arthur Falls experienced the riot. He and his father were both attacked, and he wrote at length about what they did when they were attacked and what his neighbors were doing to protect themselves from armed gang attacks during the riot in Chicago. So that was a great resource. I did a lot of work with newspapers, including the black press, which was invaluable. I had to do a lot of work comparing narratives in the black press to narratives in the white press, because there was often so many differences between them that I had to figure out which source was more reliable than the other, and look for outside corroboration. And sometimes that could get painstaking in terms of trying to verify the more important details of a particular episode of violence. I also used a lot of government records. Interestingly, the Bureau of Investigation, the forerunner of the FBI, had a lot of useful information, as did the Military Intelligence Division, because they were undertaking massive campaigns of surveillance of African Americans during the war, and they continued it after. And there's two very good books on this subject by the historian Theodore Kornweibel, who spent much of his career not just preparing these books, but also collecting and categorizing all of the evidence from the Bureau of Investigation and the Military Intelligence Division. A lot of that is now available on microfilm, has been for a while. Those reports, but I also had to look for discrepancies. I had to take into account the biases of some of the agents who were openly expressed their hostility to African Americans and who were writing their reports up to show this depiction of an uprising and of unwarranted actions by African Americans with while neglecting to examine why those attacks had occurred in the first place. Sort of letting
exactly, and leaving out causality. I'm sitting here thinking too. You probably have read the book; it's on my to-read list, and the author escapes me. It's basically about the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover and their obsession with black artists and poets and writers, and how they formed study groups and they would sit together and read black literature.
Yeah.
And they would perform the poems. Actually, the gentleman who wrote the book was on C-SPAN. I'm trying to get him to come on the podcast. And I was like, it was a surveillance society. It was a surveillance state. And they were deeply concerned about communist infiltration among black radicals and radicalizing the black public in the context of the struggle against communism. And we can laugh at it now. And this is, like I said, sort of coming full circle, asking you about your own training in the Cold War. But this was deadly serious business for elites and white elites in particular, thinking about communist insurgency and thinking about the struggle against global communism.
Right. That I think you're referring to William Maxwell and his book FBI's EYES.
But with the Cold War, as I said, it's a topic I'm eminently fascinated with. Being a child of, we're probably roughly maybe more or less the same age, child of the 70s and 80s hip hop generation, thinking about movies like Red Dawn, growing up worried about seeing a movie, for example, like The Day After, and wondering, are we going to be incinerated and actually have a future? Will there be a nuclear war? And I tell my students that because I'm now closer to 40 than 30. They look at me like I'm crazy because they can't imagine it. It's like this unfathomable thing to them. But then we start talking about terrorism and how these threats have evolved. But as a scholar of the Cold War, as I said, I love the smart and interesting people doing smart and interesting things, is my tagline here on the podcast, who sit down and chat. And this may seem like a question from afar, and it's a huge question as a softball. As a scholar of the Cold War, did the United States and its political elites, and Western elites more generally, did they actually think a nuclear war was winnable?
Most did not. And it's interesting to see their private expressions of this viewpoint and compare them with public expressions of support for civil defense efforts. And I'll offer two examples. One involves President Dwight D. Eisenhower. And I developed a great deal of respect for Eisenhower as a president and as a leader because of my work on Cold War preparations for Washington, D.C. And getting into his archives and looking at how he approached the problem, it's very evident that Eisenhower quickly came to the conclusion that nuclear war was unwinnable for all sides, and that survival was highly, highly improbable and unlucky. As a result, he really pushed the federal government, particularly the executive branch and the military, to undertake preparations that could at least allow some government function to continue if the unthinkable were to occur. So that's why secret relocation sites, some of which were and still are underground, were constructed. Mm-hmm. We can really credit Eisenhower with the driving force behind that. Eisenhower also believed that the way to avoid nuclear war was for all sides to make the rational calculation that it's unwinnable and therefore these weapons should never be used. That logic led him to support and oversee a massive buildup of the U.S. nuclear arsenal, because he believed that if the United States had overwhelming first strike capability, the Soviet Union would never dare attack. Now, that overlooks the problem of what if a weapon gets in the hands of a rogue actor, but these sorts of things we worry about in the age of terrorism weren't so much a concern during the Cold War, when the threat was primarily seen as it's going to be war between the United States and the Soviet Union.
So, but there were more than enough moments between the U.S. and the Soviet Union where nuclear war almost happened between two quote-unquote rational actors.
Right. Very close. The Cuban Missile Crisis is the most prominent example, but there was an incident during the presidency of Jimmy Carter in which a NORAD computer, this is the air defense system in Cheyenne Mountain, in Colorado, a computer malfunction. Someone put a tape in the computer, training tape. It recorded incoming Soviet ICBMs. Zbigniew Brzezinski has written about this. He gets the call from NORAD and he says, "We'll verify this." And the call comes back and they say, "Well, it's actually worse. They had said a few hundred. Now they said it was, I think, more than 1,000 were coming in." And while he was deliberating how to tell the president and what to do, then the third call came in and they said, "Oh, it was just a mistake." But that could have ended much differently if the mistake had not been detected, because there was, at that point, very little time for the president to make decisions that could not be recalled about the response.
And never mind, like 1983, Operation Able Archer. The Soviets thought, that was a preemptive strike. So in terms of the new scholarship on the Cold War, what are some of the conclusions that folks have made? Because my own, initial forays into it certainly offer a more sophisticated understanding of Cold War politics than the American people were taught through the filter of American exceptionalism. And the Soviet Union did not have the expansionist, aggressive orientation that the American and Western press wanted to present them as. If anything, they felt under siege and surrounded. I mean, am I incorrect in my reading of the historiography?
Well, it depends on where you're looking. I mean, geography is paramount here. If we take the case of Poland, the Soviet Union was aggressive and determined to install a communist regime subordinate and obedient to the Soviet Union. And we think of World War II ending after the use of atomic bombs against Japan and its final surrender, but World War II continued for the Poles who were resisting a communist takeover into 1946. And of course, the war was horrific for the Poles at its very beginning. If we turn to the Mediterranean and we look at Greece, we see that Stalin was far less aggressive and at some points actually put a check or a brake on the activities of the Greek communists because he was partial to Roosevelt's proposal or plan for the major policemen of the world, like Great Britain has its sphere, the United States has its, and the Soviet Union. And so Stalin is kind of soft pedaling on pushing communism there so that he can get communism closer to home.
So he made, again, as a rational actor, the strategic choice.
Yes. I mean, and that's a great observation. Stalin was very rational, always cold-blooded, but rational.
Power of, anecdotes and storytelling and trying to reconstruct these hidden histories about black resistance. And again, thinking about the color line in the context of the Cold War. So as we, hinted at earlier, there's a lot of also new scholarship about saying, hey, the civil rights movement and the black freedom struggle was, of course, successful because of pressure put on through people's movements, but also because white elites and other elites too, black and brown elites, understood that in the context of the Cold War, Jim and Jane Crow was an international embarrassment. So you had, never mind if you believe in the resource mobilization model or the political process model, that you had elites thinking about the big picture and then making strategic concessions in the context of the Cold War. So my one question there would be, again, why is that narrative, again, resisted by so many or so surprising?
A good example of how the color line complicated it is early on in civil defense planning, and we'll turn to Washington, D.C. as an example. Prior to the development of thermonuclear weapons, which really changed the thinking about civil defense and made it all but impossible, and also the introduction of intercontinental ballistic missiles, the threat was primarily through intercontinental aircraft, long-range aircraft, and atomic bombs. And it was easy to think of that as not being so different than strategic bombing in World War II. So how do you guard on the home front against the threat of enemy bombers? You recruit people to be volunteer spotters, to spend a couple hours each night or maybe even just a few hours a week scanning the skies with binoculars. These were called ground observer posts, and they were set up by the United States Air Force and administered by the Air Force, but they relied on volunteers. One of the most successful early ground observer posts in Washington, D.C. was set up by a black man named Lorenzo Miller. He was a janitor at an apartment building in a black neighborhood in northeast D.C. called Marshall Heights. He set up the ground observer post on the top of a school which was segregated, the J.C. Nall School, because this was before the Brown v. Board decision. This was in 1951 and 1952. This was a pretty successful ground observer post in the sense, by the measure that there were a lot of volunteers. These men came together, and mostly black men, and they watched the skies and they reported aircraft. They had books that showed them the silhouettes of aircraft so they could determine friendlies versus neutrals versus what the Soviet long-range bomber looked like. And this post folded after a couple years, but it was reactivated and then folded again. And the problem, this is where we get to the point of the color line, the problem was that a lot of the civil defense volunteer activity, the recruitment, was occurring and was successful among white middle-class residents of Washington and the suburbs. And they were not going to drive to the predominantly black neighborhood for that ground observer post. So there's a small but I think significant example of the color line impeding civil defense activity. Now, we're not addressing the question of whether it would have been effective at all. But since people did undertake it, I think it's justifiable to ask, well, how did race relations affect this volunteer activity?
And looking at your own research and looking at documents and archives about the Cold War, does the language of race is the language of race ever explicitly mentioned in terms of civil defense?
No, I can't think of any specific examples where there is this intentional planning to write off parts of the cities, any part of a city because it's predominantly one population or another. I mean, most of the urban planning for civil defense is begun in the late 40s, and there's this intense period in the early 50s. This is really before white flight begins in intensity. And so, and before the completion of the Interstate Highway Act, which, as we know, was such an enabler
of racial segregation.
Of racial segregation, of keeping neighborhoods black and keeping neighborhoods white and allowing people to move to the suburbs.
Two other Cold War related questions. I really do appreciate you indulging me in the audience here, because I mean, this is just so fascinating, because again, you have the popular memory. You have, especially if you grew up in the 80s, all these mythologies from pop culture you learned, and then you start reading and researching and you learn some other things. So we talk about, the color line may not have been as operative as I would have expected, based on sort of oral traditions and things that I was taught as a teenager and in elementary school about sort of racism and civil defense. So some documents came out, I think about a year ago. They were declassified, or maybe 6 months ago, by NATO. And some of the things that were detailed were how, number one, there were plans to use American airborne soldiers armed with tactical nuclear devices, and they're going to parachute in behind the Fulda Gap. And of course, we know that there were nukes on the Fulda Gap. So that was a given. So that was confirmed. But that there was a whole operation in Berlin with United States military officers, intelligence types, and others. And of course, throughout, what would soon become, if there was an invasion, occupied Europe, assuming it didn't go nuclear, where you would have American special forces and British and French and others training partisans for resistance. Were there similar plans here in the United States in the context of the Cold War, where you had, in terms of civil defense planning, like, okay, we have weapons stockpiled, we know we have money put aside, we know we can try to reinvigorate the mail system, all that stuff that's in the bunkers. But did they have plans to actually have a partisan force and people to train them if the U.S. was invaded? Because that begs the other question. Were they actually even thinking about the U.S. being invaded, given the stop and power water?
That does bring us back to Red Dawn, doesn't it?
Doesn't it? I have to ask. The most improbable movie ever, but still mighty entertaining, from our man who did Conan and all his other great movies.
Patrick Swayze was taken from us too soon. No, I've never come across any evidence of thoughts of training a partisan force or of an invasion. The expectation was always an aerial attack, first by bombers, and then, of course, by missiles. I haven't come across any sort of specific war plans that definitely would have generated themselves in the War Department or in the Defense Department for civil defense. One of the things I address in that book is the gulf between the military and civil defense agencies. I mean, most of the military offices and most military officials really had no use for civil defense. And their approach was, look, we are training to fight a war and to win a war. And if you ask us to think about these things on the home front, you're limiting our ability to do what we're supposed to do.
They're the dog on the leash just ready to fight. And we're not interested in talking about the doghouse.
Right.
Use that metaphor. So there go my Red Dawn teenage dreams of resistance and being the one black guy who joins the partisans and fights off the Soviet-Cuban combined, and I think Honduran or Nicaraguan forces that invade the United States. You just burst my bubble.
Yeah.
I was reading a great book, and sort of a final question then, of course, asking you to share where folks can find you online, future work, interesting things that you're working on. I think the book is called The Dead Man's Hand, and it's basically about doomsday devices in the Cold War. And the author, I think he writes for the New York Times or the Washington Post. I mean, some really chilling stuff about, all these opportunities where World War III could have jumped off, where the balloon could have gone up. He has an extensive, I learned so much too. He has a great chapter about the Korean airline shootdown in the context of the United States trying to provoke the Soviets. The KL shootdown and the U.S. plans to forward deploy near the Kola Peninsula as a way, again, of trying to provoke the Soviets. But he has this interesting sort of, aside comment. I think it's about 3 or 4 paragraphs. And again, asking you if this has been documented to be true. I have no reason to doubt his narrative, but with you being a historian, about the elaborate plans where folks like Walter Cronkite and others were given beepers or radio transceivers. And basically their locations were always known. And the plan was that the Secret Service or someone would swoop in, get all these opinion leaders, get all these other folks, bring them to places like Mount Weather, and that you would have this continuity of government, but you'd also have sort of this continuity of media personalities who would then be able, in theory, to comfort the American people. Is that true?
I don't know if that's true, and I haven't come across any evidence that something so extensive as to equip prominent newscasters with beepers was done. I haven't read that book. And I haven't read the footnotes and looked at the documentation, so I can't say one way or the other. But my initial response is that sounds really improbable. Mm-hmm. Based on the research I've done, I can tell you that there was attention to the need to, if it's possible. I mean, if there are survivors and you have the broadcast infrastructure in place to carry this out. There was attention to media relations and ways to inform the public. And there's a guy named Bill Gearhart who has a great website called CONELRAD.com. CONELRAD stands for Control of Electronic Radiation, and CONELRAD was the plan to take all broadcasting off the air so that radio waves couldn't be used as enemy navigation aids, and then only broadcast on 6:40 a.m. to survivors. And Bill has spent a lot of time trying to find this tape that's rumored to exist that was made at Eisenhower's request, that Arthur Gottfried record a message of assurance to Americans that some semblance of government existed and things would be restored to normal. He spent a lot of time trying to find that tape and still hasn't. And I just don't know that newscasters, private citizens, were given such beepers. Now, there was a program that did plan to bring prominent community leaders. This was sort of like shadow executive officials. This was set up during the Eisenhower administration. If the principals were lost in a nuclear war, these individuals would step in, and they signed agreements to do that. But I don't know that their whereabouts were monitored on a daily basis. Just didn't see anything of that nature.
But David, where can folks find you online, and what are you working on for the future?
Well, thanks for asking. Well, I've got a website, davidkrugler.com, so you can find some biographical information about me, more details about the books, and information and photos for events and interviews and articles I've written. I'm also on Facebook, so I have an author page on Facebook, so that's another way to find me. Right now, I'm not directly working on anything. I've been so busy seeing this book come to print and then undertaking its promotion that I am not doing any original research right now. But I've got several ideas I'd like to pursue. Earlier in the interview, I mentioned how I came across a lot of evidence of banishment and exile as a way to protect white supremacy and to limit opportunities for African Americans. And I think that's a topic I'd like to explore a little bit more about and find out how common it was to, order people out of town or to physically force them from town for trying to better themselves or to exercise their rights as U.S. citizens.
And that gets us right to the heart, as I'm sure you've thought about in your own work and research, that the racial state, the project that was white supremacy, was as much political and social as it was economic. And it was about the limitation of life chances, but also the physical theft of land and labor and wealth.
Right. At the same time I'm considering that idea, I'm also wondering if maybe it wouldn't be, just for my own mental health reasons, time to move to something that's not so and depressing, because a book on nuclear war followed by actual, very real, deadly racial violence might permanently sour my otherwise sunny disposition.
Your positive outlook on life is ruined.
Yeah, hard to be an optimist if I keep going down this path.
That's the thing here. I mean, we got to stay positive, forward thinking, and one foot in front of the other. But David, I just want to thank you for sitting down and chatting. It was a pleasure.
Oh, well, thank you. It's been a pleasure, Chauncey, and I really welcome and I'm thankful for the opportunity to speak about my research.
Great sharing there. Again, interesting and smart people doing interesting and smart things here on the podcast known as the Chauncey DeVega Show. So I want to thank Dr. David Krugler one more time. Think about the madness and insanity of Jim and Jane Crow, that you would actually weaken American civil defense by denying the ability of African Americans to participate. I was also a little shook too by, and if you read some of Dr. Krugler's other work, by the levels of planning in some ways in terms of American civil defense was amazingly in depth, in other ways amazingly negligent. And as I hinted at in our conversation, folks, check out The Dead Man's Hand. That is a scary, scary book. We were so close to destroying ourselves on so many occasions during the Cold War that I'm surprised that we are still here. Next episode, something a little different, very conversational, and I love good conversations. And it's funny again how the universe is small. So, read a book a few months ago, actually about a year ago, and the brother's going to hate on me if I get the title wrong. It was called Dreamt I Was in Heaven, The Rampage of the Rufus Buck Gang by Leonce Gautier. And I was like, man, this is a hell of a book about African American and Native American First Nations brothers and sisters, cowboys. And folks forget the Old West is a myth. It was multiracial. It was integrated. You had bad men and bad women of every racial background in the Old West. And to discover this book, and I don't want to give it away, about a group of black bandits, black and First Nations bandits, kicking ass and raising hell. So it was serendipitous that the brother who wrote the book reached out to me and said, hey, fan of the podcast, want to chat, want to build? And I said, absolutely. So one of the themes we have been touching upon on the website for a long time, but also especially since we've been talking about Django a lot, because again, Django is one of the most important movies in recent memory. It has come up several times in the podcast. It will come up again, hint, hint, about some future episodes with film scholars and others who are interested in the West and narratives about race, American political development, America's filmic imagination or imaginary about itself, that it's cool to think and talk about masculinity and resistance. So there's an interesting connection between this episode and our upcoming one where we spend a lot of time talking about resistance, masculinity, violence, identity. So Leonce and I, we sit down and we talk about these issues in this very sort of to and fro conversation of two like minds who are curious about violence, who are curious about race, who are very fascinated by the fact and legend of the Old West. So that's going to be the next episode. As I said, sometimes I get in the Cadillac car, to quote from Cotton Hill and King of the Hill, and sometimes I let other folk drive, sometimes we drive together, sometimes we go back and forth. And I think this is a conversation where this is a co-drive, and he drives about 10 miles and I drive 1, then he drives 5 and I drive 4. And it was just, again, kismet, as I like to say. Kismet. That's one of my favorite new words, new old words. So that's going to be the next episode here on the podcast known as the Chauncey DeVega Show. I sit down with Leonce Gautier and hope I get his name right. He'll be emailing me if I get his name wrong. And we talk about race, resistance, masculinity, identity, and his great book. So stretching, because my knee is still bothering me. The knee is going to be bothering me. So send me that good energy. Put your hands on the screen of the computer, your smartphone, your cell phone. Meditate and send Chauncey DeVega healing energy. I'm not Pat Robertson. I'm not asking you to put money on the TV. I'm asking you to help me. So, and I'm laughing because you got to laugh sometimes because that's all you got. That's all you got is laughter. So, as I always say at this point in the podcast known as the Chauncey DeVega Show, of course, as I said earlier, tweet, share, download, and support the podcast if you can. It means so much to me and so many opportunities. If you, again, told me a year or two ago that I have so many other things in development, never mind Ring of Fire, which is awesome. They've given me such an opportunity, and other folks who've had me on. Other outlets for my work. People emailing me with questions. Kind energy and support. People giving me love. And I have so many cool and wonderful guests you're going to be surprised about who are forthcoming, who I've already talked to, and who have agreed to sit down in the near future. And that's all because of you guys sharing the podcast and emailing people and giving them love. Please, after you dig deep for me, or share or tweet, download, and support the website in other ways, do something nice for your parents. My mom has been so nice in this time of hurt for me. And she's far away, but she calls me all the time, and she's worried. And it's made me think about a lot of life choices and things I need to remedy in terms of geography and distance. But I love my mom. You heard me say, don't tell her I told you that I love my mommy. That's my mommy, but she knows that. It was Mother's Day. And for folks who have their moms in their lives, please send them some love. Other folks who are like your mom, other folk who are like a mother to you, whatever their gender or sex, is send them some love. There's lots of moms in the world. Some of them are male, some of them are female, straight and gay, close and far, living and dead. Send them some love, because we're all the product of other people's investments in us. But after you send mom some love, please be nice to each other. Take care of our four-legged, our winged, our reptilian, our fish friends. Please try to do something nice for a stranger. Please call someone that you have not spoken to recently. And take care of yourself. There's no shame in self-care, and there's no shame in self-indulgence. There really isn't. So please do those things, and you'll make the world a better place. And here's another one I'm going to add. Take a nap. Attend to your health. Because this injury has really made me feel happy and just self-aware of the fact that I stay in relatively good shape so I could survive busting my butt like that. Because if I wasn't, I'd be in some serious bad way, man. I'd be hurting bad. And I can also take much better care of myself. So please, go to the doctor, get a checkup. I got to do that for myself, behind on my checkups. Watch what you eat, and just look out for yourself, because life is just too short. I said that last week when I talked about reaching out to people you haven't talked to lately, even if they don't reach back to you, because life is too short. So until next week, great guest, as I said, the one and only Great Conversation, the author of the great book, Dreamt I Was in Heaven, The Rampage of the Rufus Gang by Léonce Gautier, here on the epononymously named podcast, known as The Chauncey DeVega Show. Please take care of yourself, and please be well.